Cult of the Potato Fanfic. By multiple me 16 in 1. The Straw Hat Pirates meet the cult of the potato. The sea was too calm. That was the first bad sign. The second was the smell. Not the usual smell of salt, rot, fish, tar, and whatever crime the ocean had been fermenting that week. This was different. Warm, earthy, rich, like baked skin rosemary, wood smoke butter, and something almost holy. Luffy stood at the Sunny's lion figurehead, sniffing the wind with absolute seriousness for once. "Meat Island?" he asked. Sanji lit a cigarette and narrowed his eyes toward the horizon. "No, not meat." Usopp crossed his arms. "I've heard of this place. Probably an island where everyone worships giant cursed vegetables. Extremely dangerous. Known to swallow fleets whole." "You just made that up," Nami said. "Did I?" said Usopp, sweating already. Robin, who had been reading in the shade, turned a page. "There actually are old regional records about a farming religion in this part of the sea. A seasonal cult built around hunger, sharing, judgment, and reincarnation through harvest cycles." Chopper blinked. "That sounds kind of nice." Brook put a hand to his chest. "A religion about being harvested. How chilling. Though as a skeleton, I must say, I personally have very little to fear from peeling." Yo-ho-ho-ho-ho. Zoro was asleep against the mast and contributed nothing, as usual, which somehow still felt rude. Jin looked toward the shore. Whatever it is, the people appear gathered. And waiting. The island rose green and low from the sea, crossed by old stone walls and rows of terraced fields. White prayer ribbons fluttered from fence posts. At the center of the harbor stood a tall wooden arch carved in the shape of roots, twisting together into a crown. Hanging over it was a sign. "Welcome, wayfarers. Bring good seasoning." Frankie adjusted his sunglasses. "That is either the friendliest threat I have ever seen or the most agricultural cult in the world." "Both," Robin said pleasantly. As the Thousand Sunny docked, a bell rang from inland. Then another. Then a whole chorus of bells, pots, ladles, wooden spoons, and what sounded suspiciously like a washboard. A crowd gathered. They wore patched clothes in harvest colors. Some had little potato chip charms carved from wood or stone hanging from their necks. Several elders leaned on staffs. Children peeked out from behind aprons. At the center stood 3 figures. An old woman with a flour sack shawl and eyes like nails. A broad man carrying a soup pot like it was a sacred relic. And most alarming of all, a young acolyte holding a plain potato on a velvet cushion. The old woman stepped forward. "State yourselves before the field." Luffy jumped off the ship with a grin. "I'm Monkey D. Luffy, King of the Pirates." Nami pinched the bridge of her nose. "He is not yet." The woman looked him up and down. "Too loud, but honest." Sanji stepped down with practiced elegance. "Blackleg Sanji." "Cook," the crowd murmured with immediate respect. "Cook," repeated the broad man, nodding solemnly. "Useful." Usopp puffed up. "Captain Usopp, legendary warrior, hero of." "Coward," said the old woman. Usopp froze. "I'm sorry, what?" "Coward," she said again. "Not an insult. Just a shape. Some cowards run. Some stay and shake. Field use is both." Usopp looked wounded by how accurately he had been sworded. Robin came down the gangplank last, smiling softly. The acolyte with the potato gasped. The potato had spoken. Not out loud exactly. More like everyone heard it, the way one hears thunder through floorboards. "She reads the old dirt." Let her pass. There was a long silence. Chopper's fur stood on end. The potato talked. The entire village bowed. Luffy's eyes widened with wonder. A talking potato. He reached for it. 30 people grabbed him at once. No touching the speaking potato. That is first voice privilege. Hands off the witness route. Has the boy no home training? Luffy blinked. I just wanted to say hi. The old woman studied him, then sighed the sigh of a person who had survived many fools and expected to survive several more. You may enter, she said, if you agree to 3 rules. Nami folded her arms. Which are? The broad man lifted one thick finger. You do not mock the hungry. A second finger. You do not waste food while others need it. A third. You do not call yourself holy if you won't help carry water. Sanji exhaled smoke and gave the first truly respectful nod he had offered all day. Fair. Luffy grinned. Easy. Usopp raised a hand. Are there cursed monsters, prophecies, demon vegetables, or ritual combat? The young acolyte answered brightly, yes. Usopp screamed. They were led through the village beneath prayer lines strung with dried herbs, seed bundles, and little handwritten tags bearing promises. I will check on old Widow Mere before frost. I will fix Hobbs' roof before rain. I will bring soup to the man by the north ditch and not act superior about it. Hope begins when help gets specific. Robin slowed at that one. That's a good line, she said. The old woman heard her. Potatoes. Who? One of the 7 demi-potatoes, the acolyte said reverently. Frankie stared. The 7 what now? The 7 demi-potatoes, repeated the broad man, as if explaining the moon to an idiot. Sadiam of revelry. Spud Sprite of small mercy. Wormroot of guarding. Meadow Sprout of holy boundaries. Vinditator of winter justice. Potatosis of stubborn hope. Bloomspud of growing things. Brook lowered his head. I have lived a long and unusual life, and still the sentence 7 demi-potatoes reaches new heights. Lengths, Robin corrected gently. Tubers tend toward length. Brook put his hand over where his heart would be, if the world were less theatrical. You improve every joke and thereby insult me. At the center of the settlement stood a long table under a fig tree. At its head sat a seat left empty except for a clean bowl, a cup of water, and 1 baked potato split open with steam rising from it. For your god? Nami asked. The old woman frowned. For whoever arrives hungry and last. Nami's expression changed. Just slightly. Around the square, painted boards showed scenes from the cult scripture, a potato speaking to 3 brothers, laughing feasts, winter watchfires, humble chores, monstrous beasts with names like Moldy Me and Bernie, and above all, the broad golden image of a shining root half buried in stars. Chopper squinted at one painting. Is that potatoes in space? The acolyte nodded. The black field above. Usopp whispered, I knew it. Space potatoes. We're all going to die. Quiet, said Robin, fascinated. They were seated and served a meal so good Sanji briefly looked offended by the competition. Roasted potatoes with herbs, potato soup with leeks, pan-fried cakes, mashed potatoes with brown butter, pickled potatoes, potato bread, and a crisp dish layered with onions and cheese that made Luffy cry out like he had seen heaven. This island rules, he shouted with his mouth full. No speaking while chewing, said 5 grandmothers at once. Luffy swallowed instantly. Sorry. The broad man, whose name turned out to be Deacon Tallow, explained between ladles of soup. We are not conquerors. We are not recruiters. We are keepers. We teach that a life should flavor the world rightly. Good seasoning, good return. Bitter seasoning, back to the dirt for another try. Poisoned seasoning, he crossed himself in a strange root-shaped sign. Rejected. Jim nodded slowly. A moral order of consequence and renewal. Basically, said Robin, be useful, feed people, tell the truth, protect the vulnerable, and don't become impressive at the expense of being good. The old woman pointed at her with a spoon. You listened dangerously well. Her name was Aunt Thistle, and within 10 minutes she had decided the Straw Hats were either blessed idiots or dangerous saints, which in practice meant she fed them more. Then the trouble began. Because of course it did. A bell rang from the edge of the fields. Not the meal bell. Not the harbor bell. The sharp iron bell. The bad one. Everyone at the table stood at once. A runner came panting into the square. Storehouse breach. South wall. Black banner men. Nami went cold. Pirates. Raiders, said Jin, already rising. Not ours. Aunt Thistle's face hardened into old iron. The ones that hit winter villages. Deacon Tallow set down his soup pot. Children were ushered indoors. Elders began issuing orders with frightening calm. One group pulled buckets into a line. Another moved sacks from the public storehouse. Young guards took up long staffs and curved harvesting hooks. Zoro woke up at exactly the right moment, because the universe occasionally rewards indifference. HM, he said, standing and drawing a sword. Are we killing someone? Trying not to, said Jin, but... At the south field wall, smoke rose past bare trees. A gang of raiders in black scarves and mismatched armor had broken through the outer gate with clubs and small cannon charges. Their flag showed a rotten grin painted over a sheaf of wheat. They were already overturning carts and kicking open store bins. The leader laughed. Take the grain, take the root cellar, take the salt. Let these dirt-praying freaks chew mud. He got no farther. Sanji crossed the distance in one blur and drove a kick into his face hard enough to fold his philosophy inward. You waste food, Sanji said softly, with the tone of a man approaching religion through violence. That was your first mistake. Luffy launched himself laughing into the center of the raiders. You picked the wrong lunch place. Chaos bloomed. Usopp climbed a wall and started sniping raiders in the forehead with green stars and smoke poppers, screaming, "Fear the curse of the field." Mostly because it sounded local, and he was trying to survive. Chopper transformed and used his weight to block the breach, while villagers dragged stores to safety. Nami cracked lightning overhead, aiming wide enough not to torch the harvest. No one is setting my allies' food on fire. I hate all of you. Frankie and Brooke defended the storehouse doors with an energy that felt half battle, half stage performance. Super fortification maneuver. May I see your panties before I knock you unconscious? No. A pity. Robin's hands bloomed from fence posts and cart wheels, twisting weapons away, tripping men into irrigation ditches, folding limbs into harmless knots. Jin moved like the tide itself, redirecting force, dropping raiders without killing them, guarding the villagers first and the fight second. And Zoro, who had somehow gotten lost in a field with only one road, came back dragging 6 unconscious raiders behind him by their belts. I found these, he said. Where? No idea. Helpful, Nami snapped. At the center of it all, Aunt Thistle strode through smoke with a cast iron pan. One raider saw an old woman and laughed. He never laughed again. Not because she killed him, because she hit him so hard across the soul that his ancestors probably sat him down afterward for a corrective conversation. Meanwhile, the young acolyte had placed the speaking potato on the broken wall. The whole field went strangely quiet for one impossible second. Then the potato spoke. A storehouse is a promise made visible. Even the raiders hesitated. He who steals winter from the hungry seasons himself for judgment. The leader, bleeding from the nose, stared in horror. Why is the vegetable talking? Usopp pointed dramatically. Because you are morally doomed. It was for once a strong line. The villagers roared and surged forward with renewed force, not savage, not wild, just utterly united. Buckets moved. Children were shielded. Fires were stomped. Raiders were disarmed, pinned, bound, and sat down hard in the dirt to think about their stupid choices. Within minutes it was over. The leader of the Black Banner pirates knelt in the mud, wrists tied, glaring upward. This isn't over. Aunt Thistle leaned down until her face was inches from his. It is for today, which is when food matters. She stood and turned to the village. Count stores. Count bruises. Count children twice. The whole place moved at once. No victory cheering. No posing. No dramatic speech. Just work. The Straw Hats looked around, a little stunned. Robin smiled first. I like them. That night, after repairs were made and the wounded were bandaged, the village lit a bonfire. Not for triumph. For thanks. For the guards, for the cooks, for those who carried, for those who warned, for those who did not freeze up and make everything worse, said Deacon Tallow, looking directly at Usopp, which somehow still counted as praise. Usopp wiped away a proud tear. The feast that followed was louder than the first. Satyam, apparently, was being honored in spirit, which meant several old men told filthy jokes in scriptural cadence, while women laughed into aprons and children only understood half of it, which was apparently the traditional amount. Brook played violin. Luffy tried to eat an impossible number of roast potatoes, and nearly succeeded. Sanji traded recipes with 6 elders, and came away with 3 secrets he swore to protect with his life. Chopper sat between 2 grandmothers who kept feeding him, and calling him a good doctor until he turned scarlet under his fur. Frankie helped reinforce a grain lift and was declared mechanically righteous. Robin read portions of the Book of Spuds, aloud from an old hand-copied page, while the villagers corrected her pronunciation in unison. Nami quietly left a pouch of berries on the common table when no one was looking. Aunt Thistle saw anyway and said nothing. Jim sat with the night guards and listened to their watch plans with deep approval. Even Zoro got drawn into a drinking contest with a one-eyed farmer and lost track of who had won, which meant he probably had. Near midnight, Luffy wandered back to the empty chair at the head of the long table. The late meal had ended. One bowl still sat there warm. He looked at it, then looked up as footsteps approached. It was the young acolyte carrying the speaking potato. Luffy grinned. Can I talk to it now? The acolyte considered. Maybe. Depends whether it talks back. Luffy sat cross-legged on the ground. Hi, potato. A long pause. Then, hi, pirate. Luffy's grin widened into pure childlike joy. Shishishi. He thought for a bit. That took visible effort. Then he asked, what's good seasoning? The acolyte went still. The bonfire crackled behind them. Somewhere Brook's violin softened. From the dark fields came the smell of turned earth and ash and herbs and sea wind. The potato answered. When people are glad you came, full after you leave, and safer because you lived. Luffy sat very quiet. Then he smiled, not his fight smile, not his reckless one. The smaller one. The true one. Yeah, he said. That sounds right. In the morning, the Thousand Sunny was loaded with gifts the Straw Hats had not managed to refuse. Sacks of seed potatoes, jars of preserved herbs, a carved root charm for the mast, 7 handwritten blessings, and 1 note pinned to a basket for Sanji that, for the cook. You understand half the religion already. As the ship pulled away, the whole village gathered at the harbor. Aunt Thistle shouted through cupped hands, bring good seasoning wherever you go. Luffy waved both arms wildly. You too. Usopp leaned over the rail and called, tell history Captain Usopp defended your sacred tuber. We'll tell history you screamed first. Someone shouted back. Brook played them out with a tune that sounded like laughter trying to become prayer. Robin stood beside the masked charm, reading the last line carved into it. Hope begins when help gets specific. She touched the wood lightly. Nami looked back at the shrinking island. Strangest place we've visited in months. Frankie snorted. You say that every island? Yes, she said. And yet here we are. Sanji lit a cigarette and stared at the basket of village bread with something almost like reverence. Jin folded his arms. A good people. Chopper nodded hard. A really good people. Zoro, half asleep already, muttered, talking potato was less annoying than I expected. Luffy laughed into the wind. Behind them, the harbor arch grew smaller and smaller until it was only a mark on the shore. But the smell of warm earth and herbs stayed on the ship a long time after the island had vanished. And for weeks afterward, whenever the Straw Hats sat to eat, Sanji would slam down an extra plate in the middle of the table and glare at anyone who asked. No one touched it. Not because they were told not to. Because somewhere in the New World, on a little island of bells and soup pots and stubborn good people, they had learned that every table ought to leave room for the last hungry soul. Which, by the standards of both pirates and human beings generally, was a miracle. Buggy and Mihawk get mistaken for new archbeasts of the farmer. The first sign of trouble was the red sail. The second was the screaming. The third was that the screaming was not coming from the ship with the red sail. It was coming from the island. The Thousand Sunny had only just dropped anchor off the coast of the Potato Island for a second visit, bringing gifts, stories, and a frankly irresponsible amount of sea salt when the harbor bell began to ring like the world had been found guilty. Luffy lit up. Oh, they remembered us. No, said Nami, already pale. That is not the happy bell. A child sprinted down the dock, wild-eyed, tripped over a coil of rope, recovered with the dignity of the very young, and pointed back toward the village. They've come from the outer waters. 2 new archbeasts of the farmer. Usopp dropped his bag of turnips. 2. Robin closed her book with quiet interest. New archbeasts. That sounds promising. Promising for what? Usopp snapped. The child was shaking. One is painted like a feast gone wrong, grinning with split face and red ruin, and the other walks like winter learned to hate. Zoro, leaning against the mast, opened one eye. Sanji squinted toward the horizon. A ship was approaching the harbor mouth, bright and gaudy and disgusting in exactly the way that suggested someone had taken a circus, a funeral, and a public indecency charge and welded them together. Nami stared. Oh no. On the prow, laughing into the wind with all the confidence of a man too stupid to fear prophecy, stood Buggy the Clown. Beside him, black coat stirring slightly in the sea breeze, arms folded, expression as warm as a coffin hinge, stood Dracul Mihawk. Brook put a hand to his skull. Well, there is your feast gone wrong and winter that learned hatred. Jinbe exhaled. I see the misunderstanding. I don't, said Chopper. Robin pointed. Buggy looks like a demon carnival. Mihawk looks like if a curse bought wine. Fair, said Chopper. At the village square, the cult of the potato had already mobilized. Prayer ribbons had been taken down and replaced with ward lines of carved potato chips, black mustard wreaths, garlic braids, and iron pans hung from gates. Aunt Thistle stood at the center in full ritual shawl, flanked by Deacon Tallow and 3 winter guards holding carved stone chips. On a velvet cushion before them sat the speaking potato. A circle had been chalked around the harbor road. Across the top arch, someone had hastily nailed a fresh sign. If you are a beast, state your corruption plainly. Buggy's ship docked. He leapt ashore first, arms wide. Behold, you dirt-eating peasants. You stand before the genius jester king of the seas, the one, the only Captain Buggy. There was silence. Then a woman in the crowd shrieked, he names himself. Another cried, the painted mouse. The splintered fool. A guard gasped, an archbeast of vanity and division. Buggy froze. I'm sorry, what? Mihawk stepped ashore behind him with no visible interest in being anywhere near any of this. The crowd recoiled as one body. A little boy whispered, his eyes. An old man crossed himself in the shape of a root. Black harvest preserve us. Aunt Thistle raised her cast iron pan like a scepter. And the other? Name yourself, winter-shaped thing. Mihawk looked at her. Then at the village. Then at the wooden sign. Then at Buggy. This is your fault. Buggy flailed. How is this my fault? I didn't build the creepy vegetable church. The speaking potato spoke. The first smells of applause and empty promises. The crowd moaned in dread. The second smells of solitude sharpened into contempt. The moaning got worse. Buggy pointed accusingly at the potato. That root is slandering me. Mihawk's gaze lowered to the cushion. It speaks. Yes, said Luffy from the crowd, grinning. Isn't it great? Mihawk was quiet for a long second. Then, with the exhausted acceptance of a man who had dueled emperors, and yet still found life beneath him, he said, "Of course it does." Aunt Thistle stepped forward. "Hear now the charges of suspicion." Buggy sputtered. "Charges of what?" Deacon Tallow unrolled a scroll. "You," he said, pointing to Buggy, "are accused of being a new archbeast in the service of the farmer, possibly born from rotten laughter, leadership without labor, pride fed by panic, and the multiplication of foolishness." The villagers murmured grim approval. Deacon Tallow turned to Mihawk. "And you are accused of being another new archbeast, perhaps born of sterile excellence, distance from mercy, contempt that mistakes itself for clarity, and judgment without bread." Even Robin winced. "That," she murmured, "is quite specific." Mihawk's eyes narrowed by half a fraction. Buggy, meanwhile, was incandescent with outrage. "I am not a beast. I am a world-famous pirate. Revered, feared, adored." Aunt Thistle jabbed a finger at him. "Those three together often make a beast. That's not even fair." "It isn't meant to be," she said. Luffy was already laughing so hard he had fallen to the ground. Sanji dragged a hand down his face. "Why did they have to show up here?" "Because the sea hates us," Nami said. The cult convened a formal discernment, which, unlike most human religious procedures, actually moved quickly because everyone involved had crops to check and no patience for decorative nonsense. Buggy and Mihawk were brought to the square and made to stand inside the chalk circle while Aunt Thistle, Deacon Tallow, Robin, Jin, and the speaking potato presided. Usopp volunteered as expert witness in demonic presentation, which no one had asked for. Mihawk did not resist, because nothing here appeared worthy of his effort. Buggy resisted constantly and uselessly, which was more in line with his brand. Aunt Thistle began. "If you are beasts of the farmer, your corruption will reveal itself under simple testing." Buggy shouted, "I am not being tested by potato monks." Colt corrected the young acolyte at once. "Whatever." Deacon Tallow held up one thick finger. "Test the first food." 2 plates were set down before Buggy. One piled high with buttery roasted potatoes, one plain and modest. Beside them sat 3 hungry children and 1 exhausted widow. "Choose," said Aunt Thistle. Buggy stared. "What kind of test is this?" "The kind with only one answer," said Aunt Thistle. Buggy looked from plate to plate. To the children. To the widow. To the crowd. He swallowed. Then, trying and failing to look magnanimous, shoved the rich plate toward himself and the modest one toward the others. The square erupted. His beast behavior. The signs multiply. Buggy panicked. "What? No, 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 I need more food." "I'm bigger." "You are not bigger than 3 children and a widow combined," Aunt Thistle said flatly. "That's not how I meant it." "Too late," said Robin. Mihawk watched all this with an expression suggesting he had left his body 2 minutes ago and was now observing from a higher, less embarrassing plane. Deacon Tallow raised a second finger. "Test the second praise." A stool was brought out for Buggy. He was seated under a banner that read, "Applaud honestly." Then the villagers took turns complimenting him. Not flattering him. Complimenting him. "You are difficult to ignore. You survived several situations that should have killed you. You have a certain chaotic resilience. You are in your way memorable." Buggy began to preen by the 3rd line. By the 7th he was crying. By the 10th he was standing on the stool, arms spread wide, shouting, "Yes. Yes. More. Tell the sea." Aunt Thistle looked sadly into the middle distance. "Very grave." Usopp leaned to Nami. "In fairness, I would also fail this test." "You would fail it faster," Nami said. "Cruel but fair." Then came Mihawk's turn. Aunt Thistle approached him with the caution one uses around lit dynamite or emotionally unavailable royalty. "Test the first mercy." She gestured toward a young guard whose stance was eager but wrong. The boy held a practice sword badly, shoulders tight, grip stiff. Correct him, she said. Mihawk looked at the boy once, then at the sword, then back at the boy. You are holding it like an apology. The boy flinched. Mihawk stepped forward, adjusted the child's wrists by a fraction, shifted one foot in the dirt, nudged his shoulder down. Again, the boy tried. Better. Again. Again. By the fourth attempt, the stance was solid. The boy looked up, startled with pride. Mihawk stepped back. Adequate. The whole crowd murmured. Robin smiled faintly. Not judgment without bread, then. Aunt Thistle nodded, though she was visibly annoyed that nuance had entered the proceedings. Test the second table. He was brought to the long table and seated at the place of a guest. Bread, soup, roasted potatoes, and wine were set before him. Then an old widow with shaking hands approached, carrying one extra bowl. The square held its breath. Mihawk looked at the bowl, at the widow, then without a word stood, pulled out his chair, seated her in his place, and took the bench end for himself. The villagers collectively made the sound humans make when they are emotionally ambushed by dignity. A little girl whispered, maybe he's only shaped like a curse. Buggy shouted from across the square, why does he get the classy tests? Because we already know what you are shaped like, Aunt Thistle said. The matter might have settled there. It did not, because from the north path came a procession of shouting farmers dragging behind them 3 bound men in black scarves. Black Banner Raiders again. The same crew that had attacked the storehouse weeks earlier. Only now they were dirtier, more desperate, and carrying little wooden effigies painted to resemble Buggy. There was a terrible silence. One of the raiders spat at Buggy's feet. We found our sign in a storm shrine. Red mouth, split face, Lord of Panic and False Kings. The villagers stared at the effigies. They were horribly convincing. Round red nose, painted grin, tiny knives. One even had detached arms nailed beside him. Usopp whispered, that is not helping. Buggy screamed, I don't control their weird crafts. The lead raider snarled, we took it as blessing. Spread fear, take stores, let fools follow a painted banner and die first. Aunt Thistle went very still. Now this she understood. False courage sold to the weak, she said softly. Deacon Tallow nodded. Panic dressed as leadership. The speaking potato rumbled. A mask can become a mouth if enough cowards pray to it. The square fell silent. Buggy's expression changed. Only a little. Only for a moment. But enough. He looked at the raider effigy of himself, and for once there was no delight in being famous. That, he said, quieter now, isn't me. Nobody mocked him. Because for once the clown sounded sincere, and sincerity is rude enough to stop a crowd. Aunt Thistle studied him, then nodded once. Good. Hate it. Buggy blinked. What? Hate what they made of you, she said. Only decent answer. The raider laughed. What does it matter? A face like yours belongs to fear. Men follow bright lies. Always have. A knife flashed. Not thrown to kill. Thrown to pin. Mihawk had moved so little that it barely seemed movement at all. Yet the raider's sleeve was nailed to the post behind him by his own blade. The whole square jumped. Mihawk's voice came down like cold iron. Men follow bright lies because they are easier than discipline. He looked at Buggy, which was frankly devastating enough to count as artillery. And some men encourage that. Buggy pointed at himself with both hands. Why is this turning into my moral trial? Because you are morally trial-shaped, said Robin. Luffy was still laughing, but now there was something sharper in it. Interest. Aunt Thistle turned to the villagers. These are not archbeasts. Gasp. Even disappointment from a few of the more dramatic faithful. She raised her pan for silence. The clown is not a beast. He is a warning. This landed hard. The swordsman is not a beast. He is a blade with manners which is nearly as troubling, but not the same thing. Mihawk accepted this with the dignity of a man too, refined to ask what the hell that meant. Aunt Thistle stepped into the circle and faced Buggy directly. You are what happens when fear learns theater. When weak men mistake noise for shelter. When fools clap too quickly and panic puts on makeup. Buggy opened his mouth, then shut it, because annoyingly, for perhaps the first time in his life, someone had described him too accurately for interruption. She turned to Mihawk. And you are what happens when excellence goes so long without warmth that people forget to check if it still has a soul. The crowd inhaled. Mihawk's eyes narrowed. Then unexpectedly, a corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. More like the memory of one had passed through the room, and he had noticed. Acceptable, he said. High praise, Robin murmured. The cult held an emergency right that evening called the naming of lesser corruptions, which, like most of their best practices, sounded like an obscure theological procedure, and was actually common sense in a good coat. The raiders were made to hear the charges against them publicly. Not grandly. Precisely. You took food from winter stores. You used a false sign to make cowards feel brave. You dressed greed as destiny. You confused fear with leadership. The villagers named each corruption and tied it to a wooden marker, which they planted outside the field wall as warnings. One marker bore a clown face. Buggy objected violently. Another bore a black painted eye with a sword through it. Mihawk objected with one look so severe that 3 people apologized to him instinctively. Aunt Thistle amended the second marker. It now reads, Do not mistake distance for wisdom. Mihawk considered it, then gave the slightest nod. At supper, the long table filled again. This time Buggy sat at the far end, suspicious of all kindness. But when a child offered him the first buttered potato from a fresh tray, he stared at it like it might explode. Why are you giving me this? The little girl shrugged. Because you looked sad and loud. That is very rude. Yes, she said. But still, Buggy accepted the potato. He did not cry. He came annoyingly close. Mihawk sat under the fig tree with a cup of dark wine, and the posture of a man prepared to vanish if anyone started singing badly. Brooke sat near him and tuned his violin. You know, Brooke said, being mistaken for an archbeast is almost flattering. It suggests one has presence. It suggests these people need spectacles, Mihawk replied. Still, said Brooke, you passed. Mihawk looked toward the table where the villagers were feeding Luffy, arguing with Sanji about soup thickness, and explaining to Buggy why no, a ceremonial pan is not a crown. They have standards, he said. Brooke laughed softly. Terrible burden, standards. Humanity rarely survives contact with them. Across the fire, Deacon Tallow was teaching Buggy the simplest prayer of the field. It was not very theological. It went, let no one leave this table hungrier than they came. Buggy fumbled it twice, added titles to himself 3 times, and had to be corrected 6. Still, by the end, he got through it. Luffy leaned over to Nami, beaming. I like this island. You liked it the first time because they had 14 potato dishes. And now, Nami watched Aunt Thistle smack Usopp's hand away from a cooling tray, watched Chopper laughing with the grandmothers, watched the villagers quietly leaving space at the head of the table for whoever might arrive late. Now, she said, I like it because they're irritatingly right about people. Robin smiled into her cup. That does happen. At the edge of the firelight, the speaking potato rested on its cushion, silent for most of the night. Then just as the wind turned and the sea smell came back in, it spoke once more. The farmer breeds great beasts rarely. Everyone listened. Smaller corruptions he breeds every day. The line settled over the table like ash. Not dramatic. Just true. Aunt Thistle snorted. There, that's the whole sermon. Buggy looked at his half-eaten potato. Then at the marker with the clown face planted beyond the wall. Then back at the table. And for the span of 1 quiet minute, Captain Buggy the Clown said absolutely nothing at all. which frightened everyone far more than if he had started shouting. Epilogue. When Buggy and Mihawk left the island the next morning, they were given gifts. Mihawk received a carved black wooden potato chip on a cord. The inscription read, "Sharpness is no excuse for coldness." He stared at it for a long time before putting it away. Buggy received a painted kitchen ladle. The inscription read, "If they cheer too fast, make them carry water." He looked deeply offended, then later secretly kept it. As their ship pulled off from the dock, the villagers waved. Aunt Thistle shouted, "Do not become symbols for fools." Buggy shouted back, "I make no promises." Mihawk, standing at the stern with the patience of a condemned saint, muttered, "At last, honesty." And from the sunny, Luffy laughed loud enough to cross the whole harbor. Because somewhere between pirates, prophets, clowns, swordsmen, soup, and a talking potato, the world had once again become exactly as stupid as it needed to be to tell the truth. The Straw Hats and the 7 demi-potatoes. That year, the summons did not come by ship. It came by dream. Across many waters, under many different skies, every Straw Hat dreamed the same impossible thing. They stood in a field at night. Not an ordinary field. A vast one. Too vast. Furrows like roads. Roads like rivers. Rivers like seams in the dark earth of the world. Above it stretched a sky so black and deep, it felt less like heaven than the underside of creation itself. Stars burned low and gold, like embers caught in roots. At the center of the field stood 7 figures. Not gods exactly. Not mortals either. More like truths that had put on shapes for the sake of being seen. One laughed under a summer lantern crown, wild-eyed and beautiful with a feast bowl in one hand and a roasting stick in the other. One was slight and soft, holding seeds in both palms as if each were a secret mercy. One stood broad and still as an old gate with keys rope and a carved chip hanging at the belt. One wore a necklace of polished stone eyes and had hands both tender and merciless. One sat like winter on a doorstep, paw mark carved in frost at the feet, yellow gaze fixed on the horizon. One shone pale and strange as dawn after disaster, carrying a little lamp against the dark. And one smelled of rosemary, loam, rain, and growing things, with vines twined round the wrists and flowers tucked into work rough hair. Then they spoke as one. "The field has been breached." Luffy in the dream grinned immediately. "Okay." Nami folded her arms. "You don't even know what that means." "We do. That is why we did not ask him first." Brook clutched his chest. "Even in dreams, I am insulted." How reassuringly consistent. Yo-ho-ho-ho-ho. The 7 voices became 7. The laughing one stepped forward first. "I am Sadium. Revel if you must, but revel toward life." The slight one bowed. "I am Spudsprite. Keep the small thing alive." The broad guardian inclined his head. "I am Wormroot. Guard what is not yours alone." The stone-eyed one spoke without blinking. "I am Medusprout. Boundaries are holy." Winter's Watcher raised one claw-marked hand. "I am Vindicator. Prepare, protect, and let no one freeze while you feast." The lamp-bearer smiled sadly. "I am Potatosis. Hope is a duty." The last one touched the earth. "I am Bloomspud. To love life is to tend it." Robin, even in dream, was calm enough to ask the obvious question. "What breach?" The black field above them opened. Not split. Opened, like an eye, and in it they saw the island of the cult of the potato, the terraced fields, the fig tree, the long table, the harbor arch, the common storehouse, all under a dimming sky while something moved beneath the earth like rot gaining language. Then another voice came. Not from the 7. From below. Slow, wet, smiling, seasoning rots best from inside. The field went black. They woke at once. Every one of them. Luffy in the crow's nest. Zoro on deck with a hand already on his sword. Nami sitting upright in her bunk. Sanji on the galley floor, cigarette gone cold between his fingers. Robin with her book fallen open across her lap. Chopper shaking. Brooke silent. Jim already on his feet. Frankie staring toward the horizon. Usopp had screamed himself awake so loudly that half the ship thought they were under attack. "We're going back," Luffy said. No one argued, because once in a rare while, madness and urgency arrive wearing the same coat. By the time the Thousand Sunny cut through the harbor waters of the Potato Island, the place had already changed. The fields looked wrong. Green but wrong. Too glossy in places. Too fat. Too quick. Vines grew where no one had planted them. Potato mounds bulged like breathing things. Prayer ribbons hung damp and stained. People still worked, but their faces were drawn and their laughter had gone thin. At the harbor stood Aunt Thistle, Deacon Tallow, the young acolyte, the winter guards, and on the velvet cushion, the speaking potato. No one smiled when the straw hats came ashore. Aunt Thistle looked older, not frailer, sharper, as if the last week had filed her down to a harder edge. "You came." Luffy nodded. "You called." The acolyte blinked. "We didn't send a ship." Robin looked at the 7 carved prayer posts, now standing around the square. "No," she said quietly. "You didn't." The speaking potato spoke. "The demi-potatoes sent for you." Usopp groaned. "I hate when vegetables outrank logistics." Deacon Tallow led them through the village. At first glance, everything still functioned. Water still carried. Bread still baked. Children still moved in clumps. Guards still watched. But woven through all of it was something else. A man blessing seed with shaking hands. A woman laughing too hard at a harmless joke, then crying when she stopped. A widow standing frozen before a basket of potatoes, as if she had forgotten what food was for. A child speaking to someone who was not there. Chopper looked around, deeply unsettled. "What happened here?" Aunt Thistle answered without ceremony. "The old griefs got in." The straw hats were quiet. She continued. 3 nights ago, the field turned under a warm moon, though no one had touched it. Then people began hearing voices at dusk. Familiar ones. Lost ones. Not lies exactly. Worse, half-true comforts. Regrets with mouths. Robin's face changed. And then, Jim asked. "The rot found the hollows in people," Deacon Tallow said. "The places where mourning had settled but never healed. It took shape there." He led them to the storehouse wall. Carved into the wood in fingernail scratches and soot were the names of the dead. Not 1 or 2. Dozens. Parents. Children. Lovers. Brothers. Sisters. Friends. Those lost in hunger, winter, sea fever, childbirth, war, drink, roads, and simple bad luck. Nami looked away first. Sanji lit a cigarette he did not smoke. The young acolyte spoke in a thin voice. "It tells people that if they let the field rot, the dead will come back whole." Luffy frowned. "That's stupid." Aunt Thistle nodded once. "Yes, which is why it works on grief." No one had anything to add to that. Human beings are extremely vulnerable to the sentence they most want to hear. Entire civilizations have been built on less. At the center of the square, the 7 prayer posts had sprouted. Not metaphorically. Each carved post now bore living growth unlike anything natural. One trailed garlic flowers. One had tiny honey herbs. One smelled of smoke and salt. One had thorn vine around a stone eye. One gathered frost even in daylight. One glowed faintly at dusk. One bloomed rosemary where there should have been only wood. And at their roots, the earth was cracked in a circle. The speaking potato rumbled. "The 7 will walk." The ground shook. From each post, light moved down into the earth. Then up again in bodies. The 7 demi-potatoes rose. Not grandly, not with thunder, more like memory standing up after a long kneel. Satyam first, laughing as if joy itself had sharpened into a blade against despair. Spud Sprite next, soft and alert, carrying a flower pot full of regrowing stems. Wormroot emerged like an old tree had decided to walk. Meadow Sprout rose behind a necklace of stone eyes, gaze hard enough to make liars itch. Vinditator stepped out trailing cold breath, and the smell of winter cupboards opened in the dark. Potatoes came with a lamp so small it should not have mattered, and yet somehow lit every face in the square. Bloomspud came last, touching each root as if greeting kin. The villagers fell to their knees. The Straw Hats did not, which was probably correct for them. Luffy waved. Hi again. Sadiam grinned. There's my favorite bad idea in sandals. Hi Sadiam. Aunt Thistle looked scandalized for half a second, then gave up. Some people simply arrive pre-disrespectful. Potatoes raised the lamp. From the broken earth between the 7 rose a shape like a person made of roots, cellar mold, old tears, and half-heard voices. It had no stable face. It kept borrowing them. A child's mother, an old man's son, a wife's husband, a brother's brother, a friend's friend. Each face appeared just long enough to wound. Chopper recoiled. That's awful. The thing smiled with someone else's mouth. I am the keeper of unfinished tables. Robin narrowed her eyes. No, your grief curdled into temptation. The thing looked at her with a dead scholar's face. And what is scholarship but naming rot politely? Robin smiled a very small, dangerous smile. You're going to regret speaking to me in public. Wormroot planted his staff. This thing was fed. By what? Jimb asked. Vinditator answered. By love with nowhere to go. By promises interrupted. By names repeated after work was done. By tables with empty chairs and no right strong enough to bear them. Sanji exhaled smoke. So what's the plan? Meadow Sprout spoke. The rot cannot be cut out by swords alone. It has nested in memory. Zoro actually looked annoyed. Then why am I here? Sadiam slapped his shoulder hard enough to jolt him half a step. Because sometimes memory also needs cutting, Moss Head. Don't call me that. Then stop looking like one. The demi-potatoes turned to the Straw Hats and the villagers. Potatoes lifted the lamp higher. Before the rod is cast out, each must pass through the furrows of return. Each must meet what grief kept unfinished. Each must choose a path of seasoning for life. Not mood. Not preference. Path. Nami frowned. You're saying everyone has to face their dead. Bloomspud shook her head. Not only the dead. The broken living. The missing living. The versions of love that never reached their season. The square went very still. Because now it was not a haunting story. It was personal. Which is always where the knives are. The furrows of return lay beyond the north terraces, where the old fields rose toward a ring of standing stones. By dusk, the whole island had gathered there. The demi-potatoes stood around the circle. The Straw Hats and villagers were called one by one to walk the furrows between rows of newly turned earth. Each row showed something. Not illusion exactly. Incarnation adjacent. Echo shaped by divine mercy. Enough to wound. Enough to heal. Luffy went in laughing and came out quiet. No one asked right away. Usopp went in shaking so badly that Chopper had to push him from behind. He came out sobbing and swearing he had been insulted lovingly by the universe. Robin went in calm and came out with wet eyes and a softness around the mouth she almost never let anyone see. Frankie went in rigid and came out looking like a man who had remembered what it cost to be made. Brook came out with his violin clutched to his ribs, as if it had become an heirloom all over again. Chopper emerged crying openly, yet smiling through it in the bewildered way of someone who had been hurt and comforted by the same hand. Jin bowed when he came out, to no one visible. Nami walked in with her jaw set and walked out trembling, one hand over her mouth. Sanji came back smoking too fast and staring at the ground. Zoro came out angrier than before, which in him meant more moved than before. When Luffy was finally cornered, Nami whispered, "What did you see?" He looked out over the field. "A bunch of people I still carry," he said simply. "But they weren't asking me to stay sad. They were asking me to keep going." That was so direct and saying it upset everyone. Then the villagers passed through. An old woman found the daughter she had outlived and did not collapse, because Spud Sprite held one shoulder. A widower met his wife in the smell of bread and wet rosemary, and heard her laugh in Bloomspud's voice. A boy who had lost his father in winter stood before Vinditator, and for one moment felt his father's steadiness in the winter Demipotato's gaze and stance. Not replacement, not possession, resonance. That was how it worked. The lost loved ones were not literally trapped inside the Demi-Potatoes like emotional storage jars. It was subtler and truer than that. People felt threads, notes, familiar strengths, a way of standing, a particular mercy, a bite of humor, a protective anger, a stubborn gentleness, a bright foolish courage. They felt that the good seasoning of those they had loved had not vanished from the field. It had entered larger currents. Satyam's laughter held traces of older brothers, dead drinking companions, unruly friends, vanished cousins, beloved idiots. Spud Sprite carried the gentleness of mothers, children, small protectors, nurses, and those who quietly fed others first. Wormroot bore fathers, uncles, guardians, old neighbors, watchmen, and everyone who had stayed up while others slept. Meadow Sprout carried the fierce dead, the boundary keepers, the women who had survived, the men who had finally learned how to stop harm rather than decorate it. Vinditator bore winter-souled elders, hard mothers, survivors, practical saints, those who rationed with love and guarded with teeth. Potatoes carried the impossible ones, the laughing strugglers, the believers after disaster, those who lit lamps after burying their own. Bloomspud bore grandmothers, growers, lovers, menders, soil people, and all who had answered life's cruelty by tending anyway. The whole field became weeping. Not chaos, not collapse, just the great old human sound of pain, being given somewhere safe to go. And in the center of it, the rot thing shrieked. Because grief faced honestly is terrible food for monsters. It grew thin. Its borrowed faces flickered and failed. It tried new tactics. It spoke in the voices of the dead, but the lies landed weaker now. Stay with me and they can remain. No one moved. Let the field fall and you will feel them always. Aunt Thistle stood straighter than any saint in a painting. I have felt them always, she said. That ain't the same as obeying rot. That broke something. The whole island seemed to draw breath at once. Then the battle began. Not only with fists and swords, though there were plenty of those. Zoro and Sanji cut the root limbs whenever they lunged toward the villagers. Jim shattered the ground beneath its heaviest strikes with fish-man force, knocking buried rot nests up into the open. Frankie built a ridiculous counterweight fire salt sprayer in under 7 minutes, because apparently engineering is just sorcery with louder branding. Usopp fired mustard packets, garlic charges, and carved ward chips from a slingshot while screaming nonsense so fervently it became morale. Chopper ran triage and antidotes where rot spores touched skin. Brook played through the screaming, violin high and sorrowful, turning grief into procession rather than panic. Robin's hands bloomed across the thing's body, pinning each false face shut as she named what it was. Regret without duty. Crack. Longing without truth. Crack. Memory used as bait. Crack. Love made selfish. Crack. Nami called down lightning not on the roots in the earth, but on the storm bank the rot had gathered over the field, splitting it open so moonlight poured through. Luffy hit the main body again and again, but not randomly. Potatoes guided him. There, the knot beneath the names. Boom. There, the hunger pretending to be mercy. Boom. There, the voice that says grief should exempt a person from the living. Boom. Each blow landed with laughter, rage, and something almost like pity. Meanwhile, the 7 demi-potatoes moved through the villagers. Satyam roasted pride out of mourners, who had made their grief into a throne. Spud Sprite knelt with children, and the frail teaching them that small living acts still counted. Wormroot set guards at every breach, and reminded the strong that sorrow does not suspend duty. Meadow Sprout made the abused step back from the voices that had once owned them, blessing the boundary. Vindicator organized kitchens, blankets, stores, and a wall of practical care behind the battle line because spiritual warfare is all very moving until someone needs to. Potatoes kept the lamp lit no matter how the wind turned. Bloomspud had people plant as they fought. Literal planting. Seeds in turned rows. Cuttings in jars. Hands in earth. Life in answer to rot. The monster weakened. Not from force alone. From being answered correctly. At last it gathered itself into one final shape, huge and hollow, wearing 100 beloved faces at once. The whole island nearly broke at the sight. Then the demi-potatoes spoke together. The dead are not property of the wound. The ground answered. The villagers answered. The straw hats answered. Even Buggy would have had to answer, had he been there, probably in some unhelpful volume. Luffy launched himself high into the moonlight. Every straw hat moved with him. Nami's wind, Sanji's kick, Zoro's slash, Jin's shockwave, Frankie's blast, Robin's binding hands, Brook's cutting music, Usopp's fired wards, Chopper's upward leap and strike, and Luffy's final blow, lit by Potatoes' lamp and aimed where the rot had twisted love into possession. When it hit, the shape burst apart into dirt, salt, old tears, and a rain of potato blossoms. Silence followed. Then the field breathed. The wrongness lifted. The glossy vines sagged into normal green. The names scratched in panic no longer looked like wounds in wood. Just names. Names could stay. People fell to their knees, or into each other's arms, or onto the earth, exhausted and emptied, and relieved in the ugly sacred way human beings often are when the worst thing finally ends. Brook played softly. No one made a speech. Thank God. Speeches after grief are usually just vanity in ceremonial clothing. At dawn, the whole island gathered at the long table. It was the largest table they had ever built. Frankie had helped extend it in the night with beams from an old shed, and no one complained, because grief had burned all pettiness down to its useful elements. At the head remained the empty seat for the last hungry soul. Before the meal, each person came forward and chose. Not a rank, not a badge, a path, a life direction under one of the 7 demi-potatoes. They spoke the choice aloud. A young guard chose Wormroot, because what I guard is not mine alone. The widow who had nearly starved in silence chose Vindicator, because I will not let others freeze while I still have hands. A girl who had lost 2 brothers chose Potatoes, because hope must now be something I do. A gentle boy chose Spud Sprite, because small kindness kept me alive. A woman who had survived violence chose Meadow Sprout, because boundaries are holy, and I will make them so for others. A laughing elder chose Satyam, because I know too well what happens when joy turns mean. A farmer and new mother chose Bloomspud, because life must be tended, not admired from a porch. Then came the straw hats. No one had expected that part. The demi-potatoes had. Luffy stepped first and looked at them all with a bright, honest seriousness rare enough to matter. I'm following Satyam, he said. Not because I like parties. Because laughter should make people freer. Satyam threw his head back and roared with delight. Correct. Nami stood next. Potatoes, she said. Because hope is work, and someone has to keep it from becoming stupidity. Potatoes smiled. Also correct. Usopp, trembling and trying to stand taller than he felt, chose Wormroot. Because courage isn't the absence of fear. It's guarding people while scared out of your mind. Wormroot nodded once deeply. Sanji flicked ash away before speaking. Vindicator, he said. Feed people first. Pride later. If there's time. Vindicator's winter gaze softened by 1 degree, which was practically applause. Chopper chose Spud Sprite, because healing is small things done in time. Spud Sprite pressed a regrowing stem into his hands. Robin was quiet a long while. Then Meadow Sprout, because truth without boundaries is often just a prettier violence. Meadow Sprout bowed her head to Robin as one keeper to another. Frankie chose Bloomspud, because building something that helps people live feels closer to worship than looking cool. Bloomspud laughed, though you do also look ridiculous. Super fair. Brooke put a skeletal hand to his cravat. Potatoes, he said, because music is a lamp one carries for the living and the dead. Though I have no actual hands of flesh. Yo ho 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 ho. The joke landed because the man had earned it. Jin chose Wormroot, because strength belongs at the threshold. Wormroot placed a carved chip in his palm. Then all eyes turned to Zoro. He seemed personally offended to be included in anything symbolic. Mihawk was not there to make it worse, mercifully. At last Zoro grunted, Meadow Sprout. Everyone blinked. He scowled harder. Protection. Boundaries. Cutting harm off clean. That one. Meadow Sprout's stone eyes warmed. Good, she said. Try not to get lost on the path. The entire table laughed. Even Zoro very slightly, which terrified half the village. When the choosing was done, the 7 demi-potatoes walked the length of the table and blessed each path in turn. Not with magic fireworks. With tokens. A garlic butter sprig for Sadiam. A regrowing stem for Spud Sprite. A carved chip for Wormroot. A stone eye for Meadow Sprout. A claw-marked charm for Vindicator. A tiny lamp seal for Potatoes. A rosemary vine for Bloomspud. Each person tied or wore or pocketed their token as they pleased. Then the meal began. Potatoes in every form. Naturally, the cult would have considered anything else doctrinally unserious. Laughter came easier, not because grief was gone, because it had been given a rightful seat and not the head of the table. As morning widened, the demi-potatoes grew fainter. Not dying, receding, returning to the larger field from which they had come. Before they went, each gave one final word. Sadiam, do not let pain make you boring. Spud Sprite, small mercies are still revolutions. Wormroot guarding his love with a posture. Meadow Sprout, no wound is healed by reopening the door to harm. Vindicator, store enough to share. Potatoes, hope that costs nothing usually does nothing. Bloomspud, tend what you claim to love. Then they were gone. Only the prayer posts remained. And the tokens. And the people, who unfortunately always remain, and therefore must do the hard part. Live differently. Epilogue. When the Thousand Sunny left that afternoon, the island bells rang the good bell this time. The harbor arch still read, Welcome wayfarers. Bring good seasoning. But beneath it, someone had added a second board in fresh cut wood. Choose your path and walk IT. At the rail, each straw hat held their token. Luffy tied the garlic butter sprig into his hat's string, until Nami made him replace it with the dried charm version, because he was attracting insects. Usopp kept touching the carved chip in his pocket, as if checking courage had weight. Sanji hung the claw-marked charm near the galley. Chopper planted his regrowing stem in a little pot by the infirmary window. Robin wore the stone eye at her wrist. Frankie fixed rosemary near the Sunny's herb box for structural spirituality. Brooke set the lamp seal by his violin case. Jim tied the chip to his sash. Zoro pretended he had not kept the stone eye at all, which fooled no one. As the island faded into sea haze, Nami asked the question that had been hovering all morning. Do you think the loved ones people felt in the demi-potatoes were really them? Robin looked out over the water. I think she said that the good and the dead does not vanish. It enters what still lives. Perhaps the demi-potatoes are one way of understanding that. Luffy grinned. So they're still around. Robin smiled, in the only way that was ever going to help. No one improved on that. Sometimes the truth arrives already finished. And far behind them, on an island of soup pots, carved chips, watchfires, seed rows, and an empty chair kept ready for the last hungry soul, the people of the cult of the potato began the rest of their lives. Not cured, not spotless, just chosen, which is holier than most of what people usually mean when they use that word. Fourth wall breaking sarcastic voice. 3 years later, naturally, the pirate weirdos come back to the sacred potato island and immediately unlock localized tuber-based destiny powers. This is what mythology is for, apparently. The Straw Hats return to the cult of the potato. 3 years had passed since the choosing of paths. 3 years of storms, islands, wars avoided badly, wars entered accidentally, impossible escapes, meals fought over, enemies punched through architecture, and the ordinary sort of chaos that follows the Straw Hat crew like confetti at a funeral. And through all of it, each had kept the token. Not always out where others could see it. Not always with ceremony. But kept. Robin's stone eye bracelet. Jim's carved chip at his sash. Chopper's regrowing stem, now dried and replanted 3 times over in little pots. Sanji's claw-marked charm above the galley stove. Usopp's wormroot chip tucked in the safest pocket he owned. Brook's lamp seal tied to his violin case. Frankie's rosemary vine carving bolted, absurdly but lovingly, near the herb box. Nami's little potatosis lamp tucked in with maps and money, which somehow suited her perfectly. Zoro's meadow sprout stone eye hidden in his gear, and denied whenever mentioned. Luffy's Sadiam token woven back into his hat, after the original attempt with actual garlic butter greenery had ended in disaster and ants. So when the Thousand Sunny cut once more through the waters of the Potato Island on the eve of Sadiam's feast, there was already a feeling on board that the air knew them. The harbor knew them. The bells knew them. The island had changed. Not softened, deepened. The terraces were broader, greener, better kept. Watch platforms stood at the north wall and south fields. The storehouse had doubled in size. New prayer ribbons crossed the square like low, bright constellations. The harbor arch had been rebuilt in heavier wood, more roots carved into the posts, and now 3 signs hung from it. Welcome, wayfarers. Bring good seasoning. Choose your path and walk IT. Jest and feast tonight. Try not to lie about yourself. Sadiam's holiday. Naturally, the warning was personal. As soon as the gangplank dropped, the island exploded into noise. Children ran the docks. Women waved towels and ladles. Guards thumped staffs. Old men shouted names. Aunt Thistle, somehow even smaller and even more indestructible than before, stood at the front with Deacon Tallow and the now-grown acolyte, who no longer looked frightened of his own religion and therefore had become much more dangerous. Luffy launched himself off the ship with both arms high. We're back. Aunt Thistle squinted at him. Still loud. Good. Means death ain't won yet. That was, on this island, roughly equivalent to a hug. Sanji was immediately dragged toward 6 separate cooking stations by elders who had apparently spent 3 years preparing arguments. Usopp got mobbed by children who had grown up hearing. He once fired anti-beast mustard wards, and therefore assumed he was 10 feet tall and wise. This horrified him. Chopper was carried off by grandmothers again. Frankie was shown an expanded grain lift system, and nearly cried from respect. Brook was met by fiddlers, who greeted him like a saint of tasteful sorrow. Jin was invited at once to inspect the outer guard routes. Robin embraced Aunt Thistle without fuss and received, in return, a hard nod and a muttered "You came back proper." Nami looked over the rebuilt square, and smiled in that tiny private way she saved for competence. Zoro had just stepped down from the Sunny, and onto the island soil when he stopped. Completely. He looked at his boots, then at the earth, then at his hand. What he said flatly. The others slowed, because the same thing was happening to them all. The tokens warmed, not hot, alive. A pulse passed up through the soles of their feet, through bone and tendon and scar and memory, as if the island were answering the fact of them. Their chosen paths, quiet for years, suddenly took root in the body. Chopper gasped. His fingers glimmered with a soft green-gold threadwork, and the bruised dock worker he had just grabbed by accident blinked in surprise as an old ache in his wrist disappeared. "Wait," Chopper said. "Wait, I didn't do that." Luffy laughed and then accidentally laughed too hard, and with the laugh came a shockwave of bright, wild warmth that rippled through the whole dock. 3 old men burst out laughing against their will. 1 child's sulk vanished entirely, and 2 strangers who had been in the middle of an argument suddenly found the fight too stupid to continue. Sadium Path. Of course. Nami lifted her hand, and a tiny lamp-shaped gleam appeared over her palm, steady despite the sea wind. It flickered toward the darkest corners under the dock, revealing hidden rot in the pilings, and a dropped coin purse no one had noticed. Potatoes' Path. Usopp stepped back in alarm, and nearly collided with a wobbling fish cart. Instinctively he reached out, and the air behind him hardened into the shape of a broad-rooted shield, wooden and old, and solid as an oath. The cart bounced harmlessly off it. Wormroot Path. Frankie stomped once and a vine cracked through a gap in the dock planks, wrapping a loose beam and hauling it tight into place with absurd efficiency. Bloomspud Path. Robin flexed her fingers, and where her hands bloomed across the harbor post, each handprint left behind a dark eye-shaped grain in the woods, subtle but severe. A drunk man halfway through climbing where he shouldn't abruptly lost all interest and backed away, embarrassed. Medu Sprout Path. Sanji's cigarette ember flared blue-white in the windless air, and every simmering pot in range steadied at the exact right heat. Vindicator Path. Brook plucked one string without meaning to, and the note hung in the air as a little lantern of sound that drifted over a crying child and settled there until she calmed. Potatoes' Path again, but through music, because Brook is physically incapable of doing anything like a normal person. Jin planted one foot, and everyone within 3 paces felt it. A threshold, a line, a held ground. Not a wall. A presence. This space is protected now. Wormroot in its highest and most disciplined form. Even Zoro, to his visible annoyance, drew one sword a hand's breadth, and the shadow under the blade sharpened into a boundary line on the earth itself. 2 brawling boys stumbled to its edge, and stopped as if they had run into invisible stone. Medu Sprout. Aunt Thistle crossed her arms and looked entirely unsurprised. "Well," she said, "about time." Luffy blinked. "You knew this would happen." Deacon Tallow nodded. "The island remembers its paths. If the choosing held true, the soil would answer when you returned grown into them." Usopp pointed wildly at his shield, which was slowly dissolving into root dust. "That seems like information one mentions in a letter." "We sent one," said the acolyte. Robin glanced over. "We were at sea." "That does complicate postage," he admitted. The Feast of Sadium. That night the whole island gave itself to jest and feast. Lanterns were strung from fig tree to harbor post. Garlic braids swung beside bright ribbons. The long table was now 3 long tables joined in a horseshoe around the square. Pots bubbled, bread steamed, butter melted, fiddles, spoons, washboards, a cracked accordion, and one frankly disrespectful horn section played in rolling waves. At the center hung a banner, "Roast pride cleanly or don't bother." Luffy was in paradise. No, beyond it. Beyond paradise lies the zone where food, laughter, and moral permission to shout all overlap. Sadiam's feast was not cruelty. That was the point. Everyone roasted, but no one was flayed. Vanity, stiffness, fake holiness, self-importance, posturing, petty tyranny, romantic nonsense, dramatic self-pity, and all forms of decorative seriousness were publicly seasoned and turned on the spit. A pious man from a neighboring island got laughed at for blessing his own beard in reflective surfaces. A local fisherman was gently destroyed by 3 widows for claiming his bad knee predicted weather, when in fact it predicted stairs. Frankie got cheered for fixing a grain chute, then immediately mocked for saying, "super sanctified load-bearing reinforcement." Sanji was praised for his potatoes, and insulted for his flirting by women old enough to remember better and happy not to. Usopp, after accepting heroic treatment from children all afternoon, was publicly reminded by Aunt Thistle that bravery that announces itself too often may be trying to outrun its own smell. He took this hard because it was good. Robin, to everyone's shock, delivered one of the deadliest roasts of the evening by calmly listing 7 separate ways that false mystery is usually just selfishness in a cloak. Brook accompanied the whole thing musically, and somehow made public humiliation sound ceremonial. Luffy got up at one point, tried to roast Zoro, forgot the structure halfway through, and just shouted, "You look like you get lost in your own thoughts." The whole square screamed with laughter because it was both inaccurate and devastating. For a little while, the world held. Not perfect, not safe forever, just held. Then on the 3rd day after the feast, the North Watchfires burned black. The archbeasts come. The warning reached the square at dawn. 3 horns from the north wall, 1 from the east terraces, then the old iron storehouse bell, the one no one rang for weather. The feast tables were still half standing when the first guard stumbled into the square mud, splashed and white-faced. "Banners," he gasped. 4 of them. Deacon Tallow went still. Aunt Thistle did not swear, which was how everyone knew this was bad. The straw hats were already moving. Jin to the wall, Sanji to the kitchens and water lines, Chopper to triage, Frankie to fortifications, Nami up to the watch platform, Robin to the records hall, because she trusted information more than panic, Luffy to wherever the biggest problem would obviously be, Zoro to the wrong direction, then the right one by accident, Usopp with a face that said he wanted to live, and would therefore probably do something very brave soon. Brook to the square, bow in hand. From the north ridge they saw them. Not one army, several, and above them, moving like old sins, finally deciding to walk in daylight, came the archbeasts of the farmer. Not all 7 corruptions of all things, but enough. Moldy me, swollen with false comfort and slow rot, draped in cellar vine and wet burlap, with 1,000 whispering mouths offering the easy decay of neglected duty. Bernie, all hunger and spectacle, wreathed in flame that consumed stores faster than armies, laughing with the face of appetites dressed as celebration. Blandy, pale and smooth and numb, moving like fog through the spirit, flattening courage into indifference, beauty into beige surrender. And Shammy, stitched from fraud, excuses, false humility, and borrowed piety, changing shape with every glance, always almost righteous from a distance. Behind them came armies to match. Wrought knights in damp grain armor, hollow revelers with burning masks, ash-fed raiders, pale workers who moved without will, false priests, storehouse thieves, mock guards, cowards in banners of borrowed courage. Usopp looked at the scale of it and made the sound of a man watching his own obituary approach. "We are not winning that." "No," said Robin, who had rejoined them by then, calm in exactly the way that makes everyone else more nervous. "Not by force." Luffy cracked his fists. "Still hitting them." "Obviously," said Robin. The island powers awakened fully. When the first wave hit the north terraces, the island answered through the straw hats in earnest. Luffy's Satiam path burst like summer thunder. Every punch rang with laughter that shattered fear formations. Enemy morale broke when he grinned. Bernie's revelers, who fed on frenzy, kept stumbling when Luffy turned the energy from destructive chaos into freeing joy. He could not kill spectacle, but he could steal its rhythm. Nami's Potatoes' light mapped weak points through smoke and confusion. She could see routes, hidden survivors collapsing walls before they fell, the little threads of hope people were about to lose. Her stormcraft sharpened around those lines, not just attacking, but preserving. Usopp's wormroot powers let him raise rooted bastions wherever defenders were about to break. Brief wooden walls, shield vines, stake lattices, guard arches. They did not last long, but they lasted long enough, which is the definition of many heroic things. Sanji's Vinditator flame would not burn the hungry, the sheltering, or the food stores under his protection. His kicks moved like winter justice, harsh, precise, without waste. Wherever he fought, supply lines held. Kitchens stayed warm. Fire turned selective in his hands. Chopper's Spud Sprite gift let him accelerate healing through tiny acts. A bandage tied by him held stronger. A tea brewed by him settled panic and poison alike. Cuts closed faster. Exhaustion loosened. He could not erase devastation, but he could keep collapse from tipping. Frankie's Bloomspud path made fortifications alive. Barricades rooted. Ladders repaired themselves once. Bridges of vine and board sprang where civilians needed escape. He screamed botanical superstructural response, which nobody liked, but everybody benefited from. Brooks' Potatoes' light through music spread calm in lanes where panic was becoming deadly. His notes lit courage in people whose legs had started to shake. The dead were remembered properly where he played, which kept Moldy Me from using grief like a fishing hook. Jin's wormroot path let him consecrate ground itself. Thresholds hardened where he stood. Gates became more gate than wood. Bridges became promises. A breach met him, and remembered it should have remained closed. Robin's Meadowsprout power was the strangest and sharpest. Her hands sprouting from wall, shield, tree, and post could mark falsehood, bind corruption, and reveal where a thing crossed from wounded into violating. She could not simply crush an archbeast. They were too large, too fed, too symbolic. But she could see their moral joints. Zoro's Meadowsprout edge cut through enchantment and false claim. Where he sliced, lies lost ownership. Shami hated him instantly. For hours the island held. And still it was not enough. Because the archbeasts were not merely large enemies. They were systems of corruption walking around in monster shape. Cut one limb from Moldy Me, and 3 more damp roots pulled up from neglected store pits. Shatter Bernie's mask and flame leapt to another reveler's grip. Drive Blandy back, and she returned through apathy and the exhausted. Wound Shami, and it borrowed the face of someone trustworthy. By sunset, everyone knew the truth. They could hold. They could wound. They could save lives. They could not win like this. Luffy slammed Bernie through a watchtower, and still the thing came up laughing with fire in its throat. Zoro cut Shami clean through the torso, and watched the halves stitch together with righteous-sounding excuses. Sanji kicked Moldy Me off a supply wagon, and found the rot already in the grain sacks beneath. Nami's storm split the sky, but not the structure of what they faced. The villagers fought beautifully. Guard lines held. Soup lines held. Seed lines held. The table in the square had become triage, prayer tool bench, and command post all at once. Aunt Thistle stood on it with a pan, and a curse for every occasion. Even so, the beasts advanced. At dusk, Robin found the answer in the old woodworking shed. Robin's discovery. She had gone there because of something stupid, which is often how important discoveries arrive. Not in grand archives. In the place where someone keeps tools and old plans, and a note pinned to a beam that says things like use the DRY wood first, you animals. Inside the shed were the old ceremonial carvings of the island. Potato chips, threshold eyes, lamp seals, claw-marked doors, and old practice carvings children used to make during feast seasons. Wood potatoes, simple little carved tubers used in winter lessons, held in hand while vows were spoken, planted in mock furrows by children learning the paths, carried by mourners who had not yet found the words for grief. Robin stood still among them. Then she understood. The archbeasts were too large because they were operating unbounded, with armies feeding them symbolic force. They could not be killed by cutting. They had to be reduced, named, bounded, and assigned a shape small enough to hold. Not destroyed. Contained. Like vows. Like relics. Like warnings. Like wood potatoes. She smiled. It was not a nice smile. The binding of the beast. Robin came back to the square black with dust and carrying an armful of rough carved wooden potatoes. Frankie, seeing this in the middle of apocalypse, said the only reasonable thing. You got a plan involving cursed produce? Yes. Outstanding. Robin climbed the central table and called for silence with a voice that did not need to be loud to become law. We cannot defeat them, she said. People went still. Good. No stupid optimism. Useful start. But we can make them small enough to bear. Now the village listened like a held breath. She raised one of the wooden potatoes. These beasts grow by abstraction. They roam as atmosphere, as appetite, as rod-in systems, habits, excuses, and crowds. We need boundary, name, and vessel. Deacon Tallow's eyes widened first, then Ant Thistle's, then the acolytes, then the speaking potato from its cushion near the fig tree said, Yes. Robin continued, We bind each beast to the corruption it most specifically is. Strip away its armies. Separate symbol from swarm. Name it aloud. Force it into a bounded relic shape carved for the field. Use up blinked. You can do that. Robin looked at him. No, we can. Then the whole island moved. Because that was the thing this cult understood better than most kingdoms ever would. Some miracles are just coordinated labor performed without cowardice. The villagers in straw hats split by path. Wormroot followers carved guard runes and rooted circles at four corners of the square. Vindicator followers cleared all food, blankets, medicine, and children behind hard thresholds. No beast would feed on chaos in the rear. Spud Sprite followers carried water, bandages, tea messages, and the little acts that keep people from becoming animal with fear. Potatoes' followers lit lamps on every post and roofline, until the square glowed like a field of captured dawn. Bloomspud followers dragged in green wood, living roots, rosemary, garlic stems, and carving tools. Meadow Sprout followers marked lines in salt and charcoal, and named aloud what must not cross. Sadiam followers did the strangest job of all. They kept laughter alive, clean, and defiant, so Bernie could not claim all revelry as his. Then the fight became ritual. Luffy dragged Bernie into the circle by provoking it mercilessly. Your parties suck. A low blow but accurate. Sanji and Nami boxed Moldy Me between storehouse walls and drove her back with steam, clean fire, and pitiless logistics. Jinbe and Usopp herded Blandy into the lamp lines, where apathy had less shadow to feed on. Zoro, Robin, and Brook cornered Shammy, cutting away each borrowed face, naming each fraud aloud until it had nowhere to hide but its own hollowness. And as each archbeast was pinned within the square, the entire island named it. Not poetically, precisely. Moldy Me, false comfort that lets duty rot. Bernie, hunger dressed as celebration. Blandy, surrender of care. Shammy borrowed righteousness without labor. Each naming weakened them. Each boundary tightened. Robin's hands bloomed by the hundreds across their bodies, not crushing, but pressing shape inward. Smaller, smaller, smaller. Frankie hammered carved vessels into the earth at the center of each circle. Wood potatoes as long as forearms. Plain, heavy, fresh cut. Brook played. Nami held the lamp steady through wind. Chopper ran line to line, keeping the chanters upright. Ant Thistle shouted corrections when people got too dramatic. Deacon Tallow kept the cadence. The speaking potato rumbled like distant judgment. Then Robin gave the final instruction. Everyone whose path opposes the beast. Step forward. Against Moldy Me came Vindicator, Bloomspud, and Wormroot. Against Bernie came Sadiam and Vindicator. Against Blandy came Potatosis and Spud Sprite. Against Shammy came Meadow Sprout and Wormroot. The path followers pressed their hands to the vessels. The Straw Hats added theirs. The island itself answered. Roots rose under the square. Wood grain deepened. The carved potatoes shook like living hearts. Robin spoke the last words not as a prayer, but as a verdict. Be no larger than the harm you are. Be no freer than the truth allows. Be held until wisdom is ready for you. The beast screamed, not with pain alone, with diminishment. Bernie collapsed into flame, then ember, then a hot red knot, then into the carved wood potato with a hiss. Moldy me shrank through root, burlap, whisper, slime, and cellar breath until she was no more than a damp throb trapped in grain. Blandy went down almost willingly, reduced to pale smooth wood and one tiny pulse of empty fog. Shammy fought longest, changing face after face after face, saint, victim, elder, child, guard, lover, priest, until Robin herself stepped forward and placed one hand over its final mouth. No, she said, you do not get tenderness as camouflage. And Shammy folded. The wooden potatoes sealed shut. The armies outside the square broke at once. Because without the archbeasts animating them, much of what remained was only frightened people, raiders, opportunists, and the exhausted machinery of corruption. Dangerous still, but mortal. Beatable. Human-sized, unfortunately, which is the category where most harm actually lives. By dawn, the surviving invaders had fled surrendered, or been tied to posts to await judgment, soup, and very stern conversation. The square was wrecked. The island stood. After the battle, in the morning light, the 4 beast potatoes sat on a heavy table beneath the fig tree. No glow, no drama, just carved wood, ugly and ordinary looking, which somehow made them more frightening. Each bore its own mark now. A mold ring, a burn crack, a pale smoothness, a false gold stripe. Aunt Thistle looked at them and said, hide those where fools can't sermonize over them. Already planned, said Robin. The speaking potato gave the final ruling. Them we do not worship. Them we do not destroy. Them we remember accurately. Deacon Tallow nodded. Good, that'll preach. The villagers began repairs before breakfast. Naturally, because triumph that does not sweep up splinters is just posing. Frankie rebuilt. Sanji cooked. Chauber stitched. Jimb inspected. Brooke played the fatigue out of people's shoulders. Usopp bragged in a way that was, for once, only 40% exaggeration. Luffy helped carry beams until he got distracted, then helped again. Zoro slept sitting up against a post like a demon who had recently been employed correctly. Nami took stock of damages with a face that suggested she would invoice the universe personally. Robin stood a while beneath the fig tree, looking at the 4 trapped beast potatoes. Aunt Thistle joined her. That was ugly brilliance, the old woman said. Robin smiled faintly. Thank you. No compliment. Just accurate. They stood in silence a while. Then Aunt Thistle asked, you know this ain't the last of them. No, Robin said. But now the island knows they can be bounded. Aunt Thistle looked toward the workers, the cooks, the children carrying nails in aprons, the guards rebuilding rails, the straw hats moving among them like they had never quite left. That matters. Yes, Robin said. It does. Epilogue. Before the straw hats sailed again, the island held a quieter rite than Satiam's feast. No banners. No roasting. No songs beyond Brooke's violin and the low hum of work. Each straw hat stood once more at the harbor arch and touched their token. This time the island powers did not flare. They settled, less like gifts, more like responsibilities that had finally fit the hand properly. A new board had been hung beneath the old signs. When the beasts grow large, make them small enough to tell the truth about. Usopp read it twice and said, that is annoyingly wise. Most wisdom is, said Robin. Luffy grinned out at sea. We should come back for the next feast. Aunt Thistle from the dock shouted, only if you've gotten more honest. Luffy shouted back, no promises. Good, she yelled. Satiam hates rehearsed virtue. The Sunny pulled out over bright water. Behind them, on the repaired island of soup pots, carved chips, harsh mercy, and holy common sense, 4 wooden potatoes were carried into a deep, dry vault beneath the storehouse, wrapped not in velvet but in plain cloth, labeled carefully, and shelved beside records of famine, storm, and war. Not relics of glory. Warnings, which is a much more useful thing for people to preserve. Return of the asshole voice. Let the island remember some reckless half-mythic fire boy she never properly knew. Which is exactly how legends survive anyway, through old women with good memory and zero patience. Auntie Thistle and the shirtless fire boy. By the time the story settled into Auntie Thistle's bones, the boy was already dead. Not that she said it that way. On the island of the cult of the potato, people did not like speaking of the dead, as if they had simply dropped out of the field like loose screws from bad furniture. They spoke of seasoning, of return, of traces in the weather of a life, of how some people left behind warmth in a room that no amount of opened windows could quite remove. Still, death was death, and everyone knew it, whatever names they wrapped around it so they could carry it without dropping it on their foot. It was late summer when the children asked her. They always did. The feast of roasting had ended 2 nights before, and now the square was in that softer mood that follows a proper holiday. The worst vanity had been singed off. The pots were scrubbed. The last drunk had recovered enough dignity to pretend the songs had not been about him. Garlic strands swayed over the porches. A few colored ribbons still hung from the fig tree, faded now in the sea wind. Auntie Thistle sat in her chair by the common oven, mending a tear in a winter shawl, while the evening went amber around her. Children gathered as they always gathered when work was nearly done, and the adults' hands slowed enough for memory. One of the little girls, Junie, who had a face too honest for strategy, climbed onto the low stone wall and asked, "Tell us about the fire boy again." Auntie Thistle did not look up from her needle. "There've been several." The shirtless one said another child at once. The rude one added a third. The pretty one sighed one of the older girls to general scandal. The one who smelled like smoke and sea and trouble, said Junie. Auntie Thistle snorted. "That narrows it less than you think." The children protested until she gave in, which was what she had always intended to do. Because old age is partly the art of pretending to resist what you have already decided to grant. She set the shawl in her lap. The square around them breathed in slow village ways. Bread cooling on racks. 2 men arguing quietly over whether one wheelbarrow counted as borrowing or theft if it returned home by itself. A dog asleep under the fig tree. A prayer lamp burning at the empty chair, kept for the last hungry soul. And beyond all that, the sea. Well, Auntie Thistle said, "I never knew his name." The children leaned closer anyway. That is the nice thing about children. They still believe a story can survive missing pieces. Adults tend to panic and start inventing nonsense. "I met him," she continued, "the year after the locust wind. Before we rebuilt the North Terraces. Before your deacon had all his beard and none of his caution. Deacon Tallow, passing with a sack of onions over one shoulder, muttered, still listening. "You should," Auntie Thistle said. "It concerns bad judgment in human form." That made the children laugh, which pleased her because a story about the dead should begin with some life in the room. She pointed with the needle toward the harbor, toward memory. He came in on a filthy little boat at noon, and looked like noon had lost a wrestling match. Shirtless, sunburnt, freckled with old scars, black hair all wild, boots near worn through. Hat tied around his neck by a string because apparently his head and his priorities had parted company. He couldn't have been more than a teenager, though he had the eyes of somebody who had already run too far and would keep running anyway. Was he a pirate? Asked Junie. Auntie Thistle gave her a look. On these waters? No, child, he was a librarian. The children giggled. Yes, he was a pirate, she said. Though not a grand one then. Or maybe he was, and I didn't know it. The sea breeds fools by the dozen, and legends by clerical error. What made him special? Asked little Bran, who was at the age where he believed every story ought to justify itself early. Auntie Thistle thought on that. Nothing at first, she said. That's the important part. He did not arrive with trumpets. He did not have a crew behind him or a title in front of him. He arrived hungry, bleeding at the lip, and half laughing at something nobody else had heard. That part was true. She remembered it clearly now. The way the boy had stepped off the little skiff, like the ground itself, might be temporary. A long metal pipe slung over one shoulder, hat string dark with sweat, an orange bead necklace resting against a bare chest marked by sun and travel, and some private kind of stubbornness. He had stopped under the harbor arch, squinted up at the words carved there, and read them aloud in a hoarse voice. "Welcome, wayfarers. Bring good seasoning." Then he had grinned. "Huh," he'd said. "That's better than most places." "And then what?" Junie asked. Auntie Thistle smiled despite herself. Then he asked where he could find food, a fight, and a place to nap, in that order, which told me nearly everything I needed to know. The children laughed again. "But listen," she said, pointing the needle at them. "He wasn't mean. There's a difference. Plenty of loud young men arrive loud, because they are full of themselves. This one was loud because his soul had no door on it." That landed over them a little more quietly. Deacon Tallow, now pretending to sort garlic nearby while obviously listening, nodded without looking over. Auntie Thistle went on. "We fed him naturally. Anyone who arrives that hungry gets fed before they get sorted. The first thing he did was burn his fingers grabbing a potato from the pan too soon." "Idiot," murmured one of the boys. "Yes," said Auntie Thistle. "Keep that word nearby. It will help." He laughed when he burned himself. He laughed at everything, she said. Not because nothing hurt. Because pain arrived, and he refused to let it be the most interesting thing in the room. That was what she remembered strongest, perhaps. Not the fire. Not first. The defiance. He had eaten like a storm had taken human shape and needed butter. 4 baked potatoes split open and salted. 2 bowls of leek soup. Half a loaf. Pickles. A heel of cheese. Then he'd lean back against the well and shut his eyes like somebody trying to remember what safety felt like in small doses. Auntie Thistle had watched him from the oven. She was not yet old then, only older than him, which is often enough to begin worrying whether a person is carrying too much flame for one lifetime. What was he doing there? Asked Junie. He said he was waiting on news, Auntie Thistle answered. Wouldn't say from who. Said it like news was a person he expected to punch him in the mouth. That too had been true. He had stayed 3 days. Not long enough to belong, long enough to be remembered. On the first night, he'd slept under the fig tree because he said roofs made him restless if he hadn't earned them. On the second, he helped carry soup to the old widow by the south ditch without being asked. On the third, he nearly started a riot because one of the neighboring traders made a joke about stealing from winter stores, before rats and widows got there first. The children gasped. "Oh yes," said Auntie Thistle. That got his attention. She remembered the speed of it. 1 second the shirtless boy had been crouched by the cookfire, balancing a knife on one finger and talking nonsense to a dog. The next he was standing, smile gone, a stillness in him so sudden and total it changed the air around the table. He'd walked over to the trader. "Say it again," he'd said. Not loud. That was the part she'd remembered later. Dangerous men often get quieter before they get true. The trader, who had not yet recognized he had stepped in front of somebody else's oldest wound, laughed and repeated it uglier. Auntie Thistle had started forward then, because she knew men and escalation and the brief stupid distance between a mouth and a broken jaw. But the shirtless boy had moved first. Not with a blade. Not even with the pipe. He grabbed the trader by the collar, dragged him halfway across the square, and slammed him into the common table hard enough to rattle every bowl. Then he leaned down, face lit by cookfire, freckles and fury and all. "There are some jokes," he said, "you only get to say if you've buried enough people." The square had gone silent. No swagger. No performance. No audience work. Just Hurt speaking in a language rough enough to be useful. "What happened then?" Bran asked. "We threw the trader off the island," said Auntie Thistle. The children blinked. "Well, not at once," she amended. There was a discussion. Then we threw him off. Deacon Tallow coughed into his beard. Technically, he was escorted to his boat. Over the side of the dock, said Auntie Thistle. With moral direction. That got the laugh she wanted. But once the children settled, she went quieter. Afterward, she said, the fire boy sat by the north wall alone. I brought him water. He took it polite. Didn't look at me for a while. She could still see him there in the dark. Elbows on knees. Hat hanging down his back. Pipe across his lap. All that heat turned inward. I asked him who he'd buried. The children were silent now. And he said, Auntie Thistle continued, too many for my age. Not enough for the world to stop making more. The sea moved somewhere beyond the houses. A prayer lamp hissed softly. One of the younger boys leaned against his sister without noticing. Auntie Thistle folded the shawl over once in her lap. He didn't say names. I didn't press. The island teaches many things. One of them is that grief bruises if you prod it like fruit in a market. But why do you call him the fire boy? Asked Junie very softly now. Auntie Thistle looked toward the north fields. Because there was another piece to it. The piece that had turned a rough memory into a story. Second night, she said, storm came in fast. Dry thunder first, then sea wind. We had lanterns out on the terraces for the watch, and one of the north grain sheds got struck. Roof caught all at once. Several children straightened. They loved a fire in story. Safe from the distance of later, as humans always do. It is one of your species' more questionable habits. The bucket line started, Auntie Thistle said. Everyone moving right enough, but the wind was bad. Kept driving sparks toward the lower stores. And this boy, this half-starved little menace, runs into the burning shed. Why? Because he was young and male, and therefore vulnerable to incredibly stupid forms of courage. Deacon Tallow barked a laugh. Auntie Thistle pointed at him with the needle. You hush. You were barely better. She returned to the children. He went in because old Marrow's son had gotten trapped under a beam, trying to save the cured sacks. A murmur ran through the little group. They knew old Marrow's son. He limped in rain and overcharged for onions, but he was decent enough. The roof was going, Auntie Thistle said. We all saw it. I remember thinking, there goes one fool and possibly two. But then the impossible part. No, not impossible. She was old enough now to distrust that word. Merely unlikely in the way a rare kind of person is unlikely. He came back out carrying Marrow's boy over one shoulder, like anger had made him stronger. And the beam that fell behind him, she stopped, frowned slightly at memory. I swear before the field, the fire bent. The children all leaned in at once. It bent. Like it knew him, said Auntie Thistle. Now that she said it aloud, it sounded half mad. Good. Most true stories worth keeping have one piece that sounds slightly mad. Otherwise, later generations file them down into moral furniture. The sparks curled away from him. Not all. He got singed plenty. But the main fall rolled past him instead of on him. Like flame had taken a shine to his nerve. Junie's eyes widened. Was he magic? Auntie Thistle scoffed. Everything on the sea is magic if you're provincial enough. I don't know what he was. I know what I saw. When he came staggering out of the burning shed, coughing and grinning through black soot, half the village had stared like a god had wandered in barefoot and rude. But he'd only dumped Marrow's son into the mud and shouted for more water, then run back to help drag the grain clear. Later, when the fire was finally broken and the storm rolled fully over them, Auntie Thistle had found him sitting shirtless in the rain, steam rising off his skin like the weather was confused. You'll catch your death, she'd told him. He'd laughed. Mine'll have to catch me first. That's a good line, whispered one of the older children. It is a terrible line, said Auntie Thistle. Good lines are often terrible for the person speaking them. The children, being children, loved that too. She looked up at the darkening square. Lamps in windows. Shadows of people crossing home. The old chair at the head of the long table, waiting empty in the night. He left the next morning, she said. Just left? Asked Bryn. She nodded. News had come in a paper by Gullboat. He read one line, smiled the wrong kind of smile, and asked where he could buy fuel. No one interrupted. I asked him if the news was good. Auntie Thistle's face had gone still now, the way it always did when she got close to the part she did not fully understand but knew mattered. And he said no. But it's mine. The children were too young to catch all of that sentence. Good. They had time yet to learn how loyalty can ruin a person and crown them at once. He bought fuel, left extra coin for the widow by the south ditch without saying so, left half his dried meat with the guards, told Marrow's son not to be an idiot around beams. Then he put that hat back on, slung his pipe over his shoulder, and went. Didn't he say goodbye? He tipped 2 fingers at me from the boat, Auntie Thistle said, and shouted, your island's weird in a good way. Which is not poetry, but I suppose sincerity has its own style. Junie grinned. Did you like him? Auntie Thistle was quiet a moment. Then she said, I trusted the shape of his heart. That was the honest answer. Not that she liked his manners. They were mostly weather. Not that she approved of his judgment. She did not. Not that she thought he would live long. She had not. But she had trusted the shape of him. The children sat with that. Then one of the younger boys, no respecter of tone, asked, do you think he found what he was looking for? Auntie Thistle leaned back in her chair and looked up at the first stars. No, she said. I think he found what he had to run toward. That was more accurate. There is a difference, though humans try very hard to pretend otherwise. A little silence followed. Good silence. The kind that means a story has landed somewhere deeper than the ears. Then the grown acolyte came into the square from the records room carrying an old ledger and a small bundle of copied sea papers. He had that look on him he got when facts had cornered him, and he was trying not to enjoy it. Auntie, he said. What? I think I found your fire boy. She looked over slowly. You think often. That is not the same as usefulness. The children swiveled toward him at once like gulls toward bread. The acolyte ignored them and opened the paper bundle. There was a marine report from years ago. Then a merchant note. Then a witness account from a harbor 2 islands east. Shirtless young pirate. Black hair. Freckles. Orange hat. Carried a pipe. Associated with unusual fire phenomena. Name listed as Portgas D. Ace. The square changed. Not loudly. Just enough. Because names do that. They take a memory by the shoulders and tell it to stand up straight. Auntie Thistle repeated it once under her breath. Ace. It fit strangely well. Like a card from a deck someone had been hiding up their sleeve. Who was he? Asked Junie. The acolyte hesitated. There it was. The soft carefulness adults get around children and the dead, as if gentleness could erase reality instead of merely making room for it. He was, the acolyte said, important to some very dangerous people. Auntie Thistle held out a hand. Give me that. He passed her the paper. She read slowly. She was not quick with letters, but she was thorough, and that serves better in the long run. Portgas D. Ace. Pirate. 2nd Division Commander. Whitebeard Pirates. And then lower down, in another copied account from much later, another line. Brother to Monkey D. Luffy. Auntie Thistle stopped. Not visibly. Not much, but enough for Deacon Tallow to notice. He stepped nearer. What is it? She handed him the paper. He read, then looked up at her. And there it was between them without being spoken at first. The bright grin. The impossible appetite. The way danger went quiet around certain wounds. The shape of loyalty like a lit fuse. The shirtless fire boy. The loud boy in sandals. The same blood choice written in 2 different hands. Auntie Thistle laughed once. One short, disbelieving breath through the nose. Well, she said, that tracks. The children were outraged. What tracks? What does that mean? You know, another pirate. The loud one. The one with the hat. The one who likes potatoes. Auntie Thistle waved them into silence. It means, she said, that the sea is too small for the size of some families. Junie frowned in concentration. The rubber pirate. The laughing one. The one Sadiam likes. Auntie Thistle nodded once. That was his brother, she said. The children all made the sound children make when Revelation enters the room and sits down cross-legged. No, whispered Bran. Yes, real brother. Auntie Thistle thought of blood and choice and grief, and the many ways humans decide who counts. She thought of the fire boy saying, no, but it's mine. She thought of the straw hat boy laughing with his whole soul and carrying ghosts like weather behind his eyes. Then she said, real enough to ruin your life for, which is the category that usually matters. Nobody had anything to improve on that. The acolyte stood very still with the rest of his papers in hand. Deacon Tallow looked out toward the harbor, where dark water moved under moonlight. And Auntie Thistle, who had fed them both without knowing and scolded one, and probably would have scolded the other harder had fate allowed, sat with the strange ache of recognition arriving late. At last, Junie asked the question that had been waiting. Do you think the shirtless fire boy chose a path? Auntie Thistle smiled then. Small, sharp, sad. Oh yes, she said, whether he had words for it or not. Which one? She looked toward the fig tree, where feast ribbons still shifted in the warm night. Sadiam, she said first. Obviously, too much laughter in him not to. Then toward the winter stores. Vinditator too, in the way he couldn't bear the hungry mocked. Then down to her own hands, old and lined and still busy with mending. And maybe potatoes, she said last. Because some people burn that bright only because hope is the one thing they refuse to surrender, even when the world keeps trying to collect. The children sat with that as if it were something hot and worth holding. Then the dog woke under the fig tree, yawned, and wandered over to beg for scraps from no one in particular. The square breathed again. Auntie Thistle picked up her mending. Off with you now, she said. Stories don't exempt anyone from sleep. The children groaned, which meant they had been properly fed. As they scattered home under lamps and stars, Junie lingered a second and asked, if he came back, would you know him? Auntie Thistle threaded her needle again. No, she said. The dead change less than the living do. Junie considered that, found it unsatisfying in the way truth often is, and ran off anyway. Alone now, except for Deacon Tallow, and the old dog Auntie Thistle looked once more at the copied paper with the name on it. Portgas D. Ace. Then at the second name beneath. Monkey D. Luffy. She clicked her tongue softly. One brother made of fire, she murmured, the other made of appetite and trouble. Deacon Tallow smiled into the dark. Sounds biblical. No, said Auntie Thistle, folding the paper shut. Sounds human. And out past the harbor, where the sea kept its own records badly and forever, the night wind moved warm as old breath over the island, through the fig leaves, past the empty chair at the head of the table, and into the fields where all good seasoning, sooner or later, went back to ground. Return of that one voice. Naturally, the family therapy session becomes a public agricultural roast, then a vacation, then a murder, theft, apocalypse chase, and a final burial judgment in poisoned earth. This is what happens when nobody in a bloodline believes in moderation. The Straw Hats, Garp, Dragon, and the final burying of the farmer. When the Straw Hats brought Monkey D, Garp, and Monkey D, Dragon to the island of the cult of the potato, they did not describe it as an intervention. They described it as a vacation. This was a lie, not a complete lie. There would be rest. There would be food. There would be sea wind and warm evenings, and a shocking number of potato dishes prepared by people whose idea of hospitality included emotional violence in moral service. But first there would be roasting. Cruel, precise, deserved roasting. because Satyam's feast had come again, and the straw hats, being by now not only beloved but structurally dangerous to the rhythm of island life, had written ahead. Prepare 2 special guests for public cooking. 1 neglectful father. 1 disastrous grandfather. Please do not kill them, unless they get self-righteous. Auntie Thistle had approved this request at once. So when the Thousand Sunny dropped anchor that late summer under a sky blue as enamel, the harbor arch had gained a temporary 4th sign. Monkey men remove ego at dock. Luffy came flying off the ship laughing. Usopp hit the dock dramatically and kissed the planks like he had survived a war. Frankie had rebuilt part of the Sunny's stern on the voyage and was proud enough to be insufferable. Sanji carried sacks of spices and acted like he wasn't excited. Robin looked like she had been waiting for this exact social experiment for months. And behind them, dragged less physically than morally, came Monkey D. Garp and Monkey D. Dragon. Garp stood broad and infuriatingly upright, picking his nose like the world had not arranged a public tribunal against him. Dragon looked like someone had tried to sculpt a thunderstorm into a father, and then left halfway through the empathy. The villagers took one look and understood. Auntie Thistle stepped forward with a pan on one hip, and her face arranged in the deep satisfaction of a woman who had spent years waiting for 2 men like this to enter range. So she said, "These are the famous idiots." Garp barked a laugh. "I like her." "You won't," said Nami. Dragon's eyes passed over the arch, the prayer ribbons, the watchtowers, the square beyond. "You brought us to a cult." Robin smiled. "A functioning one." "That does narrow the insult," Sanji said. Luffy grinned wide enough to count as a threat. "You're getting roasted tonight." Garp crossed his arms. "By who?" The entire village, who had gathered around the square by then, answered in one voice. "Everybody." Even Dragon blinked at that. The great roasting of the monkey men. Satyam's feast began at sunset. Lanterns were strung from fig tree to roofline. The long tables were filled. The fiddlers tuned. Garlic and rosemary swung and warmed. Potatoes baked, boiled, fried, whipped, smashed, roasted, candied, herbed, and crisped in trays that glowed gold in firelight. At the center of the square stood 2 carved stools beneath a banner reading, "Love is not an excuse for bad fathering." Dragon looked up at it and exhaled one grim breath through his nose. Garp laughed so hard he had to brace on his knees. "You go first," Dragon said. "No, no," said Garp, wiping his eyes. "Age before absence." Auntie Thistle pointed with a wooden spoon. Zip. The amazing thing was that they did. Not because they feared the island physically, though by now they had both noticed that half its grandmothers moved with the confidence of hidden weapons. No, they sat because somewhere beneath all the legend and stubbornness and bad choices, both men recognized one of the rarest forces in the world. A room full of people who were unimpressed. The square went still. Then the roasting began. Deacon Tallow opened, because he had the cadence for it. "We gather tonight under Satyam's eye to laugh the stiffness out of lies, vanity, old excuses, and men who mistook distance for sacrifice, when in fact it was mostly convenience with a dramatic coat." The crowd murmured approval. Satyam's prayer post by the fig tree rattled in the wind like it was enjoying itself. Auntie Thistle took Garp first. "You," she said, "are built like a harbor wall and parented like weather damage." The square exploded. Garp slapped his thigh and roared. Robin, seated beside Chopper, murmured strong opening. Auntie Thistle continued. "You loved hard, yes. Fed children, yes. Fought for them in your own broken-headed way, yes. But you also treated emotional clarity like it was a marine paperwork problem. Raised boys on fists, grief, and contradictory ethics, then acted surprised when they turned out insane in original directions." Garp laughed harder, but there was color in his face now. A fisherman from the East Terraces stood up. "Vice Admiral, respectfully, if your mentorship style was good luck idiot, then congratulations." They learned it. More laughter. Then Dragon's turn. Auntie Thistle looked him up and down with the merciless calm of a woman assessing spoiled produce. "And you," she said, "have the exact face of a man who thinks being symbolic counts as being present." The whole village made the sound of a knife finding joint. Luffy screamed with delight. Dragon did not move, which was perhaps wise, because any movement might have counted as confession. Auntie Thistle went on. "You stood for the world, and good for you. Somebody should. But children are not abstract victims, and fatherhood is not a note pinned to history saying you meant well while elsewhere." "Damn," Usopp whispered. "Deserved," Nami said. Robin's turn came next, because she had earned one. She rose with a cup in hand, and the quiet smile of a woman about to perform surgery in public. "Monkey D. Dragon," she said, "you possess many excellent qualities. Strategic patience, global moral vision, capacity for sacrifice, magnificent cheekbones. However, none of these raised a child." The square nearly came apart. Even Brooke had to stop playing for a second. Then she turned to Garp. "And Vice Admiral Garp, you deserve credit for caring deeply, which you managed to demonstrate with such bizarre aggression, that the line between devotion and property damage often became purely academic." Chopper clapped before realizing this was not technically a medical conference. Villagers lined up. A widow told Garp, "You have the aura of a man who'd save a baby from a fire and then call it weak for crying." A guard told Dragon, "You seem like you would send a thoughtful revolution and forget a birthday." A little old man with one eye said to both of them, "Together you raised one pirate king candidate, one fire tragedy, and one emotional weather event. That is not governance. That is agricultural chaos." Sanji delivered his judgment while ladling potatoes onto plates with surgical elegance. Feeding a kid isn't just food. It's attention. It's being around. It's making the plate before they beg for it. Vindicator Path people at the tables thumped cups in approval. Usopp got up, sweating already from the responsibility of being publicly perceptive. "Also, and I mean this with respect, you both have that exact same dumb family disease where you act like not saying the loving thing makes it stronger somehow." The crowd gasped, then laughed, then gasped again because the coward had spoken a great truth. Garp looked away first. Dragon looked at the table. Then Luffy stood. No grin. Not angry either. Just honest in the way that cuts deepest, because it arrives without ornament. "You both did some good things," he said. "And some garbage things. I'm not here because I want an apology dinner. I just wanted you to sit still long enough to hear people tell the truth to your faces." Silence. Then Sadiam's prayer post cracked in the warm wind like a handclap. Luffy broke into a grin after all. Also because it's funny. That saved everybody from drowning in sincerity, which is never ideal in public. Garp barked a laugh again, but this time it ended rougher. Dragon's mouth moved once very slightly. "You brought me across half the sea for this." Luffy nodded. "Yep." Auntie Thistle slammed a tray of roasted potatoes down in front of both men. "Eat," she said. "Self-knowledge works better with butter." And somehow, because the world occasionally stumbles into wisdom by accident, that became the tone of the next months. The long vacation. They stayed. What was supposed to be a few days stretched into weeks, then months. At first because nobody quite wanted to leave after the roasting, and then because life on the island had a way of making departure look theatrical. There was always a wall to fix, a watch post to improve, soup to stir, ribbons to ready, boats to tar, a harvest to bring in, a night breeze too good to waste. Dragon vanished for hours at a time into long talks with Robin, Deacon Tallow, and the record keepers about revolutions, systems, famines, mutual aid, and why most empires seem determined to confuse order with hunger. Garp taught children how to throw properly, and got beaten 3 separate times by Auntie Thistle in arguments about responsibility. Luffy was as happy as a saintless fool in summer. He swam, fought, ate, napped under the fig tree, helped only when it looked fun, accidentally helped a lot, and was used by the island children as a climbing surface and moral cautionary tale. Sanji and the kitchen women became a terrifying culinary parliament. Nami improved the island's storm warning system in 3 weeks and extorted exactly nothing for it, which alarmed everyone who knew her well. Usopp built signal rigs, then turned them into elaborate legends. Half the village now believed the North Watchtower housed a spirit called the Terrified Guardian. It was mostly just him. Brook played music in the evenings that made old men remember and young people hopeful, which is a dangerous combination but a beautiful one. Frankie rebuilt the outer grain lift into something so efficient that the entire harvest moved like choreography. He cried openly the first time it worked perfectly. Chopper planted healing herbs with Spud Sprite Path Elders and learned 17 new uses for onion steam and mustard compresses. Jin trained the guard lines until every threshold on the island felt more itself. Zoro somehow got lost on an island he knew well and wound up helping 3 different work crews by accident, which everyone agreed was the most ethical way for him to volunteer. And every few nights, under stars and fig leaves, they told stories. Stories of storms, of brothers, of losses, of seas too wide, of absurd enemies, of the dead who remained in people's hands and habits. Auntie Thistle spoke often of the shirtless fire boy then, though never too softly. Memory on this island was not made of glass. It was built to be carried. For a while all of it held. Then one morning the bells did not ring right. The theft. Before dawn, the sky turned the color of old dishwater. No birds. No kitchen smoke. No watch change call. Luffy woke first because something felt wrong in the soil, wrong in the air, wrong in the space where habit should have been. He rolled from his pallet under the fig tree and stood. So did Robin, already alert, which is usually a bad sign. Within minutes, the whole village was stirring. Then the scream came from the storehouse vault. A raw, ragged sound. Not fear. Discovery. They found the young watchman in the lower chamber. Hobbs' youngest boy. 20 maybe. Thick-shouldered, serious-eyed, proud of being trusted with the night watch. He lay on the stone floor beside the open vault, throat cut clean, one hand still reaching toward the alarm cord he had not had time to pull. The 4 wooden potatoes were gone. For one long second, the whole vault held still. No noise. No crying. No words. Even grief had not yet caught up. Then Auntie Thistle made the sound old women make when the world proves itself filthier than expected. Not a scream. A curse so cold it felt like weather turning. Chopper dropped to his knees by the body, even though he knew. Even though everyone knew. Jin checked the room. Robin checked the hinges, the grain, the dust, the lines carved in stone. Nami went pale at once. No sign of break-in. There is, Robin said, voice very calm. It simply came from the wrong side. Dragon stood in the doorway like a storm with a face. Garp beside him, suddenly not old at all. Sanji covered the boy with his own coat before his mother could reach the room. Then the speaking potato, from its place upstairs on the ceremonial cushion, began to rumble so hard the bowls on the long table shook. The whole island heard it. The farmer walks. Outside over the north terraces, the sky opened in a bruise-colored split. And from the poisoned lands beyond the old field wall rose the farmer. Not metaphor, not doctrine, not the name people used for corruption when they needed a shape. He came, tall as the memory of famine, hat broad and torn, coat of stitched sacks and root fiber and weathered leather, face mostly shadow beneath the brim, except for a grin too patient to be human. In one hand he carried a hooked harvest blade black with old use. At his feet slithered the 4 stolen wooden potatoes, cracked now, leaking smoke, mold, ash, pale fog, and false gold light. Around him walked beasts, not the arch-beasts fully freed again. Worse in some ways. Half-born things, part tool and part corruption. The farmer's own old companions of labor twisted by cruelty. Bernie's ember hounds, Moldy Me's cellar root swine, Blandy's pale crows, Shammy's false shepherds in stitched masks. The villagers gathered at the square and saw him. Even the sea seemed to recoil from shore. Luffy stepped forward first. "Give them back." The farmer looked at him, then at the whole island, then at the body being carried up from the vault. When he spoke, the voice came like a shovel through wet soil. "You built a fine little field." No one answered. "I came to collect what men always feed me in time." Auntie Thistle, standing beside Hob and his wife as they held their dead, said in a voice more terrible than shouting, "You came to steal from a grave and a table." The farmer tilted his head. "Are they different?" That was enough. No speech, no ritual, no preparation beyond what people had already become. The island surged. The hunt across the poisoned ground. The farmer did not fight like the archbeasts. He withdrew, not in fear, in invitation. He moved toward the far fields beyond the old walls, the land the cult had never replanted. Bare poisoned soil where, legend said, the first worst seasonings had been thrown. The place where the field had refused growth. "He wants us there," Robin said, already running. "Yes," said Dragon. Luffy grinned with all his teeth. "Good." The chase cut through morning like a blade. The Straw Hats, Garp, Dragon, the guard lines, the path followers, Auntie Thistle herself with pan in belt and murder in her bones, all of them driving hard over terraces, through weed-run gullies, across the old stone wall and out into the dead ground. Nothing grew there. Not grass, not moss, not weed. Only cracked earth the color of bruised bone. The 4 stolen wood potatoes rolled behind the farmer like obedient curses, splitting wider with each yard. Smoke leaked from them. Bernie laughed in sparks. Moldy Me whispered from the seams. Blandy breathed numb cold. Shammy made promises in voices almost familiar. The poisoned soil weakened everyone at first. Luffy's Satiam joy came out ragged. Nami's lamplight flickered. Usopp's rooted shields collapsed too soon. Frankie's bloomspud vines could not catch. Chopper's healing herbs blackened at the edges. Brook's notes sounded thin. Jim's threshold slipped. Robin's hands on the ground came back dusted gray. "This soil rejects path," Robin said. "No," said Auntie Thistle, running harder than anyone her age had a right to. "It remembers before path." The farmer stopped at last in the center of the bare basin. There, half buried in the dead earth, stood old things. Broken plow teeth, rotten fence posts, prayer stones turned face down, the bones of abandoned storage bins, the black remains of some first field long cursed and left. The origin pit, the place from which the farmer and his corruptions had once risen into human practice and hunger. He turned. Behind him, the 4 wood potatoes split open entirely, and the archbeasts began to climb out once more. Not whole yet, but enough. Bernie with ember eyes. Moldy Me dripping root rot. Blandy white as surrender. Shammy already trying on decent faces. The farmer lifted the harvest blade. "Here is what feeds me most." He gestured not at the island, at the people. Love turned possessive. Duty turned hollow. Hunger turned low. Hope turned performance. The ground beneath their feet shuddered. Garp stepped beside Luffy. Dragon beside Robin. For once the whole line of them stood like one family, and one village, and one field answering. Then the fight began. It was brutal. Garp hit like old thunder, and caved in one false shepherd with a punch that sent its borrowed holiness across the basin in splinters. Dragon tore the poisoned wind sideways, and stripped Blandy's fog off the ground long enough for Nami to mark its true center. Luffy hammered Bernie back again and again, laughter sharp as defiance. Zoro and Sanji cut opposite flanks, one severing Fall's claim, the other preserving every retreat path behind the line. Jinbe anchored the center. Frankie built barricades out of dead plow frames and shattered bins. Usopp, somehow, found courage by proximity to collective rage, and became a nightmare with ward stakes. Chopper kept the living upright through sheer refusal. Brooke played notes so fierce they sounded like memory refusing erasure. Robin watched, not passively, never that. She watched the farmer, the way he moved, the way the soil answered him, the way the archbeasts fed not from air now, but from the poisoned ground itself. Then she understood. Not the beasts, she shouted. The soil. The farmer heard that and smiled under the hat brim. Good. A real opponent at last. Robin's eyes went to the old broken field remains around them. The dead plow line. The face-down prayer stones. The ruined first furrow. This was not merely where the farmer stood. It was where he belonged, where he was strongest, which meant, by the cruel, beautiful logic of old magic and older morality, it was also the only place that could truly hold him. Not killed, not cleaned, held, the speaking potato's old teachings came back to her in a rush. Be no freer than the truth allows. She turned to the whole line. Drive him inward. She called, all of them, into the first furrow. Dragon saw it first and acted without needing more. Garp laughed once wild and terrible and changed his angle. Jin repositioned the center. Nami shifted the storms. Usopp raised failing root barriers not to stop the beasts, but to channel them. Sanji and Zoro cut lanes. Frankie collapsed old debris and measured falls. Brooke's music pulled morale toward the trap. Chopper screamed himself hoarse, keeping people on their feet. Auntie Thistle grabbed the face-down prayer stones one by one, and with Hobbs' grieving father beside her, began setting them upright again around the first furrow. One by one, hands bleeding, teeth clenched, no theatrics. The line tightened. Bernie lunged, and Luffy drove him backward with a roar that cracked the gray morning. Moldy Me spread root mire, and Sanji burned every clean path except one. Blandy tried to dissolve into numb air, and Nami lit the basin like judgment. Shammy borrowed Hobbs' dead son's face for one hideous second, and Robin, with a sound of pure disgust, shattered the false mask in both hands. The farmer saw the circle closing too late. He turned to break east and found Garp there, grinning like a wrecking ball given purpose. He turned west and met Dragon's storm wall. He surged north and Jimb held. South was Auntie Thistle, Hob Deacon Tallow the villagers, and the standing prayer stones. Not glamorous, not conquerors, just people whose table he had touched. He stopped, and for the first time the grin altered. Not fear, recognition. The circle locked. Robin raised both arms. Her hands bloomed from every standing stone, every broken post, every old plow tooth, every shard of first field left in the poisoned basin. Not gentle hands now. Boundary hands. Verdict hands. The whole dead ground shuddered. The beasts came from this soil, she said. Then let the soil remember them fully. The speaking potato's voice rolled over the basin, from impossibly far and impossibly near at once. Poison, know your poison. Root, know your rot. Earth, hold what it made. The bare ground split. Not open to swallow the innocent. Only at the marked first furrow. The farmer and the half-freed beasts sank to the knees. Bernie howled. Moldy Me clawed. Blandy tried to thin into mist and found no permission. Shammy shouted in 100 stolen voices, and none could get purchase. The farmer planted the harvest blade in the soil and tried to rise by old right. Luffy hit him. Garp hit him. Dragon's storm drove him down. Jim's force anchored him. Robin's hands pressed him inward. And every villager spoke at once the names of the corruptions they refused. Not abstractly, personally, plainly. Winter stolen. Love manipulated. Duty abandoned. Hunger glorified. Fear sold. Mercy faked. Children neglected. The dead used. The table betrayed. Each naming made the soil tighter. The farmer sank to the waist. He looked up once, under the shadowed brim, and for a single instant they glimpsed the face beneath. Not a devil, not a god's. A man-shape made from every season someone chose power over care, and called it necessity. That was worse. The speaking potato gave the final sentence. Farmer and beasts, to the bare poisoned soil that bred you. There you shall remain, until the golden potato's final harvest. The whole basin answered. The poisoned earth closed over them. Not fast, not dramatic. Slow, final, as burial should be when truth is doing it. Last to vanish was the black brim of the hat. Then Bernie's ember eye. Then Moldy Me's whisper root. Then Blandy's pale fog. Then Shammy's lying mouth. Then nothing but cracked bare soil, marked by one long dark furrow and ringed standing stones. Silence. Only wind. Only breathing. Only the ache afterward, which is how human victory usually feels if it cost anything real. The burial of the watchmen. They did not celebrate that day. Of course not. Only bad religions party too soon. They carried Hobbs' son home first. The whole island walked with him. Even Garp and Dragon. Especially them. Garp bareheaded. Dragon silent as winter thunder. The straw hats around the family without fuss, which is how real respect moves. They buried the young watchman at the edge of the north fields, where the sea could be heard at night, and the storehouse roof could be seen in morning light. Auntie Thistle spoke over him. Not pretty words. Right words. He held watch. He reached for the bell. He died between theft and warning. That counts. Let no one make him smaller than his duty. Hob wept openly. So did men who had not cried in years. The island did not look away. After the grave was filled, Sanji left the first hot food there. Brook played low. Chopper planted a little regrowing herb near the stone. Robin pressed her palm to the marker and left a dark-eyed grain in the wood, so falsehood would never sit easy there. Then they went back to rebuild. Because grief on this island was never treated as an argument against labor. It was one of the reasons for it. Afterward, the 4 stolen wood potatoes were gone forever. Or rather, they had become unnecessary. The things they once held were back in the place that could bear them longest. The poison basin beyond the old wall was marked off with 7 posts, 1 for each path, and one final sign beneath them all. Do not dig here for power. Usopp suggested a longer warning with dramatic carvings. Auntie Thistle told him brevity was holier. The vacation ended, but not at once. Nobody had the stomach for immediate departure after that. So they stayed long enough to mend roofs, reset the vault, dig drainage, reinforce the wall, and help the watch reorganize. Garp took 3 shifts in a row like a man, punishing himself through usefulness. Dragon worked in silence beside fathers and sons, and did not try to turn any of it into a speech. Luffy sat one evening under the fig tree beside Auntie Thistle and said, "You think they'll stay buried?" She considered the basin beyond the wall, the prayer lamps, the repaired square, the empty chair at the head of the long table. "Yes," she said, "till the final harvest, if the sentence holds. And if it doesn't," Auntie Thistle snorted, "then people will have once again failed to maintain simple boundaries around obvious evil, which would be the most human thing imaginable." Luffy laughed. Then after a moment, quieter. "He killed the watchman." "Yes." Luffy looked at his hands. Auntie Thistle glanced at him sideways. "Don't go making the mistake of thinking final justice erases immediate grief. That's coward theology." Luffy nodded once. He liked her because she never decorated the truth. The speaking potato, on its cushion nearby, said nothing for a long time. Then as the sun went down red over the terraced fields, it spoke one last time that season. The golden potato's final harvest is not hunger. It is sorting. What fed the field shall remain. What fed only itself shall end. No one improved on that. Not Dragon, Not Garp. Not Robin. Not even the priests of the place. Sometimes the root says the thing finished. Epilogue. When at last the thousand sunny pulled away, the whole island gathered at the dock. The arch still bore all its old signs. The sea wind took them in order. Welcome, wayfarers. Bring good seasoning. Choose your path and walk it. Jest and feast tonight. Try not to lie about yourself. And newest of all, do not dig where justice buried something for a reason. Garp stood on the dock, arms folded, pretending he had not needed any of this. Dragon stood beside him, pretending even harder. Luffy pointed at both of them from the Sunny's rail. We're bringing you back next year. Antithistle yelled, good. They still got flaws left. Everybody does, shouted Garp. That ain't a defense. She shouted back. The square laughed. Even Dragon, very slightly, which was unsettling enough that several villagers crossed themselves in the shape of roots. As the ship turned out toward open water, Robin looked back at the island. At the fig tree, at the long table, at the small new grave by the north fields, at the standing stones beyond the wall where bare poisoned soil lay still under watch. Then she looked ahead again. Do you think that's the end of the farmer? Chopper asked softly. Robin answered with the kind of honesty the island had trained into all of them. In the soil, perhaps no. In the world, certainly not. Men replant him all the time. That sat over them for a moment. Then Sanji set down lunch. Nami shouted at Luffy. Usopp exaggerated the battle immediately. Frankie started planning a better vault design from memory. Brook composed something mournful and rude. Zoro slept. Jin watched the horizon. Garp laughed at nothing. Dragon said almost nothing, which for him may have been growth. And behind them, on an island of soup, sharp mercy, shared labor, hard laughter, and holy common sense, the cult of the potato kept watch over its dead, its living, and the poisoned ground where justice had buried what should not walk free until the golden potato's final harvest. Which, by the standards of this world, was about as close to peace as anyone ought to trust.